Mabuhay, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our webinar for today entitled Libraries and Archives Disasters, Mitigation, Recovery, and Mold, brought to you by the Society of Filipino Archivists, Philippine Librarians Association Incorporated, NCR Librarians Council, and the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies. I am Ria Rowena U. Apolinario from the UPSLIS, your host and moderator for today. Now, may I request everyone to please sing the Philippine National Anthem.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulubig, di ka pasisihil, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukhaw. May dilagang tula, tawag sa paglayang minamahal, ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na naglilingling. Ang bituin at araw niyang kailan pag may di magdidihil, lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
And to officially start our program, let us all welcome the Dean of the UP School of Library and Information Studies, Professor Mary Grace P. Golfo Barcelona, to give her opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone here in Zoom and to all our viewers in the different parts of the world. Welcome to the webinar on Library and Archives Disasters, Mitigation, Recovery, and Mold. This is a webinar jointly organized by the Philippine Librarians Association, Inc. or PLI, Society of Filipino Archivists, SFA, and the School of Library and Information Studies, SLIS. There are two distinct and common denominators among these three entities. The PLI is the first professional organization for librarians, SFA is the first professional association for archivists, and UPSLIS is the first LIS school in the Philippines and in the region. In fact, SLIS has just celebrated its 60th founding anniversary this month. So all three are the first in their respective areas: LIS practice, archival practice, and LIS education. Another common factor is all three have always strived to provide continuing education to their members. And today, all three entities have decided to work together towards this goal of providing and sharing knowledge in a topic which is very pragmatic and native to us in the Philippines: disasters, mitigation, and recovery. And this is another first for all three to be joining forces and working together to organize this webinar. And indeed, 3 is better than 1 because as of last week, we have almost 2,000 registrants for this webinar. As I mentioned earlier, the topic is very pragmatic and native to us: disasters, mitigation, and recovery. Because anyone who has lived here could attest that disaster, whether natural or man-made, has been a constant in the country. Situated along the Pacific Rim of Fire, the Philippines contains 37 volcanoes. Its northern and eastern regions lie within the typhoon belt. Thus, it is also constantly mauled by typhoons, averaging 20 times annually. This environmental condition places the country in constant risk of natural disasters. And according to a report of various Maplecraft, natural hazard risk is compounded in the Philippines by poor institutional and societal capacity to manage, respond, and recover from natural hazards events. Thus, our topic for this webinar is really of great consequence for us, librarians and archivists, as we advocate for the preservation of our cultural heritage, together with our colleagues in the allied professions who are also concerned with the cultural preservation of our country. All right, I will no longer keep you waiting. I know all of you are excited to listen to our STEAM resource speaker discuss about mitigation, recovery, and one of the most common causes of deterioration, mold. Again, thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the webinar on library and archives disasters, mitigation, recovery, and mold. Let us all listen, learn, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Dean Grace. The response that we received towards this event was very overwhelming. Like what Dean Grace mentioned, we have 1,865 registered participants from the Philippines and around the globe. Most of our registrants are working in libraries. We also have participants who are archivists, records managers, museum and cultural workers, and book enthusiasts. This lecture also is being simulcast in the UPSLIS YouTube and Twitch channels, as well as in SFA's Facebook page. So, indeed, our topic for today entices the interests of many. And I know a lot of you are very very excited, but allow me to present some house rules and reminders for our Zoom participants. Kindly mute your microphone when you are not speaking to eliminate background noise and prevent distractions. Participants are encouraged to ask questions to the speaker during the Q&A portion of the webinar. You may key in your questions while the presentation is still ongoing by visiting Slido and using the code disaster15. You may also use the QR code shown on screen throughout the talk. We will not entertain questions written in chat. And finally, a link to the evaluation form will be sent via email to all registered participants after the event. All right, let us go to the main event today. And to introduce our guest speaker, we have the president of the Philippine Librarians Association Incorporated and former president of the Society of Filipino Archivists, Miss Emma M. Ray.
In 2006, I presented a country report at the third regional training workshop on the preservation of and access to documentary heritage in Asia and the Pacific in Cheongju and Seoul, South Korea. In that paper, I started with the following statements. 404 disasters occur each year in all parts of the globe. Approximately 197 take place in Asia, 111 in the Americas, 77 in Europe, 61 in Africa, and 18 in Oceania. 50,000 people are killed annually, 74,000 seriously injured, 5 million displaced from their homes, and 80 million affected in some peripheral way. Far less publicized is the resultant extraordinary damage to cultural property, like property in libraries and archives. I am sure many of you have encountered these statements in my lectures because I am always compelled to give these figures to create a scenario why disaster management should be taken seriously. Of course, these lines were from a very respected figure in the field of preservation and disaster management, Mr. Randy Silverman. In that 2006 training workshop, I did not know that the author I was quoting was in the audience, who happened to be our keynote speaker, who shared many beautiful and highly instructive lectures on disaster management, recovery of books, and planning for disasters. In between plenary lectures, visits to the Jikji Museum, research institutes for conservation, conservation workshops, and laboratories, we would share stories about disaster management workshops that we conduct in the Philippines. So before we left Korea, I already told him that someday we will invite him to the Philippines because I thought then that Filipino librarians and archivists should learn from our Randy Silverman. That someday became a reality today. I am highly honored to be given the task of introducing our resource speaker. Randy Silverman is a preservation librarian at the University of Utah's Marriott Library, who has worked in the field of book preservation since 1978. He holds a master's degree in library science and teaches preservation as adjunct faculty for Emporia State University in Kansas, Dominican University in Illinois, and University of Arizona. He is a founding member of the Western States Preservation Assistance Service and teaches disaster preparedness workshops throughout Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. He consults broadly, has 84 professional publications, and has presented professional lectures or workshops in 27 U.S. states and 11 countries internationally, including Georgia, Russia, Switzerland, Trinidad and Tobago, Uzbekistan, and now the Philippines. He received the American Library Association's Banks Harris Award in 2013 for outstanding achievement in the field of preservation, was selected for a Fulbright Specialist Project in Tashkent, Uzbekistan at Alisher Navoy National Library in 2013 to 2014, and received the Utah Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters Gardner Prize for Outstanding Academic Contributions in 2016. It may take an hour or more to talk about Randy's achievements. I invite you to see the University of Utah's profile of him if you are interested in his activities and publications. At this point, I want to personally thank you, Randy, for graciously accepting our invitation. Having a heart of a conservator and a disaster management advocate, I am sure that you may have come earlier to the Philippines if I answered, yes, we need help, when you emailed me back then to know how we are doing after Typhoon Yolanda struck the country. So, dear participants, after 15 years, truly grateful and honored, let's all welcome Mr. Randy H. Silverman.
Good morning, Philippines. I am so pleased to be here today. My name is Randy Silverman. I'm the head of preservation at the University of Utah's Marriott Library, and this is a distinct honor for me. I am so grateful to Mac Junio for inviting me to speak to you and to address the Society of Filipino Archivists. And a special shout out to Emma Ray, who 15 years ago talked with me at a UNESCO meeting in Korea about coming to the Philippines to present. And here, after all that time, I'm able to speak with you, and it's due to Emma's persistence. So thank you very much, Emma. And thank you all for attending today. I hope this is as much fun for you as it's going to be for me. I'd like to address library and archive disasters from 3 different perspectives. I'd like to talk about mitigation, recovery, and mold. And mitigation is the most important of these because, in fact, the process of recovery is basically acknowledging that we failed and trying to salvage the pieces. And things will never look the same as they did before the disaster. And so if possible, if we can prevent that from happening, that's a good day. The problem with that is it takes energy to mitigate disasters. It takes time, it takes consideration, often funding, and interestingly, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this, there is much more energy to focus on a disaster after the event to help with the recovery than there is to prevent the thing from happening in the first place. I think that's sadly misplaced energy. I would love to incite action before the events that would culminate in saving collections from being ruined or damaged at all, if possible. So that is the general goal. And I want to talk about mold because it's my feeling after spending my whole career looking at mold issues, I feel mold is not well understood, and I really want to talk about it because I think I'm beginning to get a handle on what mold is all about and maybe can offer some tips on how we can cope with mold prevention as well as recovery. So let's talk about disasters first off. Disasters happen. This is a grim reality, but it's the honest truth. They are the unexpected to some extent, which often means we weren't paying attention because some of this stuff is predictable. In hindsight, we're able to see the things leading up to an event and we're able to actually understand what we might have done to prevent it. But now we have to try and look full circle, look with open eyes, with the third eye open at what is causing these events and how we can intercede, how we can cause the event to be averted or minimized. And I want to speak for just a moment about the images in this slide set. Most of the images are photographs or borrowed images. I hope to have credited everyone who's given me an image to use. And also the paintings are from William Blake, who is an enlightened poet and philosopher and artist who lived in the 18th century, early 19th century, and I find his work remarkably fulfilling even now. I'd just like to share William Blake images with you as we go. So let's talk about earthquakes, because in fact, the planet is in motion, not just spinning on its axis, but the plates on Earth continue to shift and to move. And specifically in the Philippines, we're dealing with what's called the Ring of Fire. This is a highly active area for earthquakes and large storms. And in fact, if you look at this image, which is really gorgeous depiction over a 100-year period, a 100-year span, the area that's most highlighted is because each event that's over a 4.0 earthquake has been highlighted, with the bigger ones getting a larger illumination. And during a 100-year period, the part of the world that stands out the most is the Ring of Fire. So you are sitting right in the heart of it. It's a very active earthquake zone. There are other storms to be worried about. Hurricanes, for instance, which in your part of the world we call cyclones and typhoons. The picture on the screen at the moment is from Hurricane Katrina in the US in 2005, a massive storm. And it was immensely damaging to the US. A heads up that the storms were starting to change, I think, starting to become huge and more frequent and more damaging. And there are floods, and rightfully, when we're talking about disasters, hearkening back to the Florence flood of November 1966 is key, because that flood formally initiates the beginning of the book and paper conservation world as we know it today. It changed things dramatically. The Florence flood was unprecedented in its size, and in its the damage that it caused was unbelievable. And it was so shocking that people came from all over the world to try and help with the recovery. So people came from the US to Italy and from everywhere, from Asia, and students came from all over Europe. They hitchhiked to be there. And the image I'm wanting to focus on at the moment was taken by a photographer working for National Geographic, whose name is Balthazar Korab. Balthazar Korab is a very kind gentleman. I've talked with him. while he was alive. And this image was taken inside of the Vatican's Restoration Institute in Rome, where vellum books, 13th and 14th century vellum manuscript books, were taken after the Florence flood from the Florence Cathedral outside the Piazza del Duomo and delivered to this conservation lab in the Vatican. And Mario Penzzuti is examining the books, looking carefully, thoughtfully at what amounts to a row, 2 rows of vellum books that are soaked, absolutely wet vellum books. And he's pondering, what are we going to do with these? And the truth of that moment, this moment that's captured on film, is those books will never look this good again. Because in fact, vellum is an extremely hygroscopic material, meaning it changes shape dramatically with moisture changes, just humidity changes in the air, much less getting wet. And within 2 days, those books were all going to be extremely deformed. And the process to cope with drying a vellum book, to flatten it, is complex. The way this works is the book has to be disbound to separate individual folding leaves, and they need to be humidified to soften the vellum and then stretched like a drum head so that they can reestablish a flat plane. And often that takes 2 or 3 different steps of humidifying and stretching, and over time, over 6 weeks or 2 months, that leaf will eventually become flat enough to be refolded and then resewn into a book format. Again, the slide, we'll back up 1 second. The slide shows you maybe 50 vellum books, well over $1 million worth of rare books, 13th and 14th century manuscripts spread out in this space. And the question that comes to my mind, the puzzle for me, is how in the world, in a city like Florence, which is known to flood historically about once every 100 years, why would you store 50 vellum books of great value below the waterline? What possesses people to ignore the obvious and to take a risk that things will be okay? I fear that this is not unusual. In fact, it's pretty common. But I challenge you today to think in those terms when we discuss the possibilities for mitigation, because they will impact your institution and the future of the collections that you're charged to preserve. And the opposite of this is a slide that I have. It's a pretty low quality slide, but of a very interesting moment where Gary Frost made a decision when Iowa's Cedar River was flooding, and his institution was downstream of the flood. And upstream of the flood, things were really bad. They were whole towns were being flooded and inundating the river's valley as it progressed south. And so the University of Iowa library conservator determined with several days advance notice that the strongest move that they could make in preparation for this impending flood was to remove all of the books from the basement of the university library, all of the books. And they spent 3 days packing out this basement library. As it turns out, they couldn't get them all in 3 days, so they prioritized the most valuable, the things that they really would hate to lose. And they took them out of the basement and they put them above ground in a dry storage place. And as it turns out, the river didn't flood this part of the University of Iowa. There were other parts of campus that were hit, but the library was spared from this particular event. So is Gary Frost a fool for having spent all of that energy students working through the night, 3 different nights, to empty out a basement that didn't have to be emptied out. No, Gary Frost is my hero because he took action. And the truth is, at the moment that he did that, there was a grave possibility that he was going to be justified in making that decision. And so it's energy well spent. They just simply had to put the books back on the shelf and call it a day. Back in Florence, it's now over 50 years since the Florence flood occurred. And today, there are still thousands and thousands of books waiting to be restored. So many books that they will never be treated. There are too many for the resources to treat them have dwindled over time, and it's likely that they will never be treated. So in effect, preventing the damage is far more efficacious than allowing this disaster to occur. So let's talk about mitigation for a minute. What can we do, right? What can we do? Some things I'm going to talk about are expensive. Look for the possibilities here that may impact you. And maybe you can modify some of these ideas and bring 2 ideas together and find a third alternative that I'm unaware of, but I'd love to hear about. So talk with me when this is over at some point if you get motivated to do something that's interesting. One thing we can think about are planning and policy changes. What kinds of plans can we make? Well, the very first plan is a disaster plan. And the process of making a disaster plan can be simplified down to where the result is a simple 1-page, both sides, 2-page document that can fold up into a little pocket planner. And that is pictured here on the screen, folded up. The pocket planner contains prioritized phone numbers, lists of people that you may want to contact in an emergency. And who would those be? Well, they start out being the director of your institution, and if you call that person the museum manager, fine. If you call them the library director, fine. The assistant directors, the boards of directors in charge of city utilities and various priorities for your institution, the kinds of people that are key to the functioning of your institution, the insurance person for your institution, and figuring out what those priorities are is the planning process. Who would you need to talk with 24 hours into your event? Those are the people you're going to want to call. And the other side of the pocket planner includes a reminder of things that you need to consider immediately once the disaster has happened. What are the immediate response steps? When will you do an assessment? How will you go through the assessment in such a way as to do it safely? And interestingly, there's a possibility of including a schematic drawing of the collection itself that prioritizes the high-value material. So by marking this schematic, you can direct the recovery people to know that this is the high value, not this stuff over here, but this particular thing or this particular thing, and therefore identify the priorities for recovery. The reason that this is key is if we minimize damage to the most important parts of the collection first, maybe they will be less damaged in the long run. And certainly they're the things that should that are worth the effort as a priority. The fact that you've marked up a plan with the priorities of the institution is also a security problem. We have to be sure that this plan is distributed to people who are trustworthy, people connected with the institution, and each time that we revise it, maybe every couple of years, the old copies should be pulled back in and destroyed, and the new copy issued, and a list kept of who's got a copy of the disaster plan for the institution. Because in fact, that is very important classified information. Another kind of planning at the state level in the United States, we have in Utah something called the Emergency Support Functions, and function number 11 is the protection of cultural resources and historic properties. This is now part of the state's emergency plan. It wasn't always. The priority was always human life safety first. And of course, we never get past that priority if we're going to focus on human life, because you can never be too prepared for something that will be a huge community-wide disaster. And we're in an earthquake zone here in Utah, expecting a very large earthquake someday. So by planning for this, we then set out the priorities for steps to be taken in the aftermath of a disaster with the key players who own collections in the state. And so the University of Utah, my institution, has 3 different collecting institutions of note and 2 less important but still important collecting institutions, state archives, the state history. Each of these institutions has a very valuable part of the heritage for this region. When we had an earthquake here about a year and a half ago, the plan that we had created worked perfectly. People took an assessment of their institutional levels of disaster. It was a very small earthquake. And they called the Emergency Operations Center or emailed and delivered the assessment to a single person there who could then prioritize the damage among all of the institutions that reported in, and we could figure out where the priority for recovery was. And so that is our plan. The reason for funneling all the information to one point is that that is the most effective way to gather resources if we needed them, to be able to distribute and to be able to prioritize where those resources needed to go first, second, and third. Another piece of planning that we've done in the past year is to pre-approve a disaster recovery company, a firm that in the face of a disaster could come to Utah from out of state and bring resources that will not be affected by the disaster itself, and bring those specifically to the aid of the cultural institutions in play. So we went through the bid process, evaluated the companies that submitted an application for a bid, and we chose Belfour USA, which is a company that has multiple different offices scattered around the US and around the world. And we have now created this pre-approved process for 5 years, and it can be revisited again after that time and renewed. So these steps help us in preparing for the eventuality that we know is going to occur. We're in a seismic zone. There are other things that happen here, large windstorms, etc. And we're trying to do it in advance. It's so much more strategic to plan in advance than to pick up the pieces afterwards. A story related to that is the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library, and I'd like to play a video about their monumental move in 2011.
Sometimes we don't realize what we have until it's threatened or almost lost. In 2008, swirling, muddy floodwaters of historic proportions consumed a national icon on the banks of the Cedar River. The National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library was swamped. Exhibition work spanning 15 years was destroyed. Some library books were filled with mud and sand. Even the few things lost seemed overwhelming. But as the waters receded, a curious thing happened. The people responsible for the museum's fate came together to create a new vision for the building and the cultures it represented. First, the museum was moved into smaller, temporary quarters just a block away. Next, inspired by creative minds, the museum board decided to save and move the £3 million building to higher ground and double its size.
I think. Good morning, Cedar Rapids. Good morning, Iowa. Good morning, world. share in this historic event. This is a pinnacle moment, not just for us, but for the entire city of Cedar Rapids. 3 years ago, we all watched as floodwaters devastated the city. Now we're celebrating a milestone that symbolizes a city on the move.
Move that museum! Move that museum! Move that museum! Jeremy's taking a last look. I can see it. I'm not sure all of you can.
Slow and steady, and it only goes one speed, and so they have to kind of, when they turn it on, it just kind of keeps moving. So, and then they have to stop, and they have to adjust a little, and then they go again. You know, yeah.
The impetus for this move is to simply prevent the kind of flooding that happened in 2011 from ever happening again. The problem, from my perspective, is twofold. One, how did we ever manage to choose a piece of property to build this museum, which is not that old, that is smack dab in the middle of the floodplain, so that it was in harm's way to begin with? And then the question of the amount of effort required to physically remove the building from its foundation and take it to higher ground is remarkable. It's a remarkable feat. But trying to do this before the impetus of the flood would have been impossible. So in fact, it's the flood that provides the incentive to solve the problem, when it would be much more strategic to solve the problem in the first place. My bookbinding instructor used to say, measure twice, cut once. And I think this is the kind of issue that we're dealing with. It is a phenomenon that they managed to move the museum once and for all to save it from ever flooding again. But look what it took to get us there, and with all of that energy, all of the cost associated with moving a museum, couldn't we have done that in advance? Isn't that technically possible too, before the collection is inundated with water and basically ruined? So what are we talking about when we're thinking about taking an environmental assessment? Well, is it in the floodplain? That would be the first question. You know, if we're considering building a museum, or if we're considering creating a disaster plan, what exactly are the risks? So this is an aerial shot of Hurricane Katrina before it made landfall. Notice that the storm takes up a good portion, almost a half, of the Gulf of Mexico. That's a great big place. It was a huge storm, and yet when it came ashore in Mississippi in August of 2005, it was only a Category 4 hurricane out of 5 different possible categories. So it's a monster storm, but there are bigger ones yet. And the consequences of that storm in Mississippi, which is not talked about nearly as much as Louisiana, was massive devastation, especially along the coast. This building pictured is from a group of buildings called Beauvoir, which is Jefferson Davis's home and presidential library. It's a private museum. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy in the United States Civil War. So he's actually not a president of the United States, but he's still considered an important character in Biloxi, Mississippi. So this building was constructed, his presidential library was constructed fairly recently before the storm, less than 10 years before the hurricane came ashore. Steel and glass building, the glass came to the floor, steel and glass on the first floor of this structure, and the storm surge from the Gulf of Mexico took out the entire collection and threw it all over the surrounding area at about a half a mile from the museum, just spread it out. So this gives you an idea of how powerful the storm surge was. Just past this, this edifice, which is still standing, which is the only piece of the Confederate Soldiers Hospital that survived the storm, you can see the Gulf of Mexico. In the background there, that is the Gulf. It is less than 100 yards from the Presidential Library and from this structure. This building was built in 1910, and it didn't fare any better with the direct storm surge. All that survived is this piece here. But Beauvoir itself, the home of President Jefferson Davis, which was built in 1830 up on these risers, survived the storm. Yes, the porch was washed away, a piece of the roof, and the windows were blown out. But within 3 years of the storm, Beauvoir was able to be restored. This leads me to understand something about the local conditions in Biloxi, Mississippi, which is facing the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, people in 1830 understood the nature of building close to the Gulf of Mexico when they built the building up on risers. And so that common idea, that architectural insight was lost by 1910 with the Confederate Soldiers Hospital, and certainly by the time of the Presidential Library, where a building was constructed, steel and glass, that might have looked great in New York, but didn't really function, didn't work on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi. So where are we, and what are we trying to prepare for in both the construction and the maintenance of our sites? So we have to live with our existing buildings. Sometimes they are what they are, and you're just coming to work and inherited a given problem. What are steps that can be taken to prevent damage from large weather? Because the weather is getting bigger. So what can we do? And the question again comes to the access to resources. So the next story is about Vizcaya Museum and Garden in Miami, Florida, that suffered damage again, and in their attempt to prepare for bigger storms in the future, have installed something called the Tiger Dam Water-Filled Flood Control System.
Vizcaya Museum and Gardens is known for its historical significance and its lush gardens. But after Hurricane Irma in 2017, it was left unrecognizable. With the installation of new technology today, though, they're hoping to keep storm surge out in the future. Hurricane season is just over a month away, and Vizcaya Museum and Gardens isn't wasting any time getting prepared. The historic location got an upgrade today.
It's a unique flood control solution that uses giant inflatable tubes. What that will do is help protect us against storm surge flooding.
The damage to the historical site was immense in the wake of Hurricane Irma back in 2017.
The entire garden was flooded, and it was flooded in 3, 4, 5 feet of salt water. It also severely damaged our cafe and shop. And the combined total for all of that damage was well over $1 million.
And it's not just the water they want to keep out.
We had a wave runner that was deposited in the gardens. We had all kinds of things.
The innovative flood control system, called Tiger Dam, aims to stop storm surge in its tracks. It's made up of 50-foot inflatable tubes that each fill up with about 1,300 gallons of water.
This is part of a already extensive, detailed, and involved action plan and response plan that we have.
The system can be put in place and ready to protect in under 10 hours with less than a dozen people.
The flexibility of deployment is a big advantage for us.
And with worsening king tides and rising seas, this would come in handy during more than just hurricane season.
As king tides get worse and the water level begins to rise, we do anticipate that Tiger Dam will provide some protection for that.
And it's not just Vizcaya Museum and Gardens that should be prepping for hurricane season. With just over 30 days away, you too should start your hurricane prep. At Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, Angie Laspin, NBC6 News.
Fascinating thing about this solution, the Tiger Dam, is that a building that's existing that was converted to a museum long after it was a palatial estate, it can be modified, and it's a very clever technology. The entire installation of emergency Tiger Dam barriers, those water dams which can be inflated, cost Vizcaya $50,000 roughly. When you compare that, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money out of pocket. But when you compare it to $1 million loss 2 years prior or 3 years prior, it certainly makes sense to consider the option of avoiding all of that damage and being able to include a solution when there's a huge storm coming in or a rising tide of unusual dimension. So it may be an expensive solution. You may think offhandedly, that's simply not for me, it's way too expensive. But consider that in the future, some technology like this may be very interesting to know about. And so I share it with you today. What about simpler things that we can do to modify buildings? And how would we determine what those are? The first thing I'd like to recommend is that you consider getting a tour of your building by people that are very aware of the kinds of damage that can occur from failed wiring, from electrical problems, from potential fire risks, from flooding. So in this case, in the US, we have fire marshals or the heads of fire departments make building tours every year, every other year of public spaces. So they will come in a public building, come through the entire building and look carefully at the risks that they can spot. They make out a report, they offer it up to the institution, and many institutions, greet them at the door and they're very nice, but they put the report away, and they don't do anything with it. This is a really valuable insight. It costs nothing. They come for free, and they're willing to share. If you call them and ask for the fire department's input and they walk your building with you, it's likely that you'll discover things like this inspection verified that people should close the metal door to the breaker box. That's required by code, but people don't often know that. And the reason is when a breaker is actually activated, it sparks, and that spark could be huge and can cause a building-wide fire. So closing the metal door and keeping it closed by the rules of the institution is a very important step. The use of space heaters in my building at the Marriott Library at the University of Utah have been outlawed because, in fact, space heaters are known to cause fires. They're often left running when people leave the building. They forget to turn them off, and they can potentially short out over time. Similarly, the use of extension cords, while it's designed for temporary power for some purpose, sometimes can be relied on for a constant source of electricity for lighting for museums or other similar uses. Extension cords are an extremely bad idea. There are fire risks and should be used only temporarily and never just counted on as the source of electricity in a space. The shelving in a place like this, notice that all of the books are up off the floor. This is the Salt Lake County Records Office, all of the land records for the county dating all the way back to the origins of Salt Lake county itself exist in this one room. Notice that the shelving gives the books about 3 inches off the floor as a buffer in case there is general leaking or water collected in the space due to a roof leak, a pipe leak, some other unforeseen accident. It may be unforeseen, but notice that the shelving manufacturers understand this and as a standard build things up off the floor. So I'm telling you now, one friend to another, please consider getting all your collection material up off the floor. Even if you're putting it on a pallet temporarily, it's key that it not be exposed to the risk of just sitting at a low spot in the room. In a seismic zone in the US, water heaters are mandated by code to be strapped so that they won't fall over when there's ground shaking. And the reason for that is there is a source of heating at the base of the water heater that is an open flame, and if the water heater tips over, that flame can catch the closet on fire, which will burn down the house, which is just a really bad outcome from ground shaking that didn't actually tear down the house itself. When the University of Utah Marriott Library upgraded its seismic protections some years back, the shelving was addressed. And so all of the shelving prior to that was just freestanding. But in an earthquake, that shelving full of books is likely to start moving and then topple over, causing all of the shelves to domino and fall over as well. So they were all bolted to the concrete pad of the building so that they wouldn't move off the ground in an earthquake. They'll move all right. They'll rock back and forth, and books will fall off of them. We'll address that in a moment. But know that this is a life-saving step, that steel shelving loaded with books is really heavy, and if you happen to be standing in the stacks and the ground starts moving, the stacks falling over can be very damaging to a person, possibly fatal. In terms of planning for new construction, the idea of creating a pipe system, a culinary water system within the building that will survive ground shaking is very important, because sometimes the pipes become broken, they separate, and there's leaks inside of a building due to the earthquake. So flooding actually occurs as a result of earthquakes inside of buildings. There is a pipe system that was created by Victaulic that is interlocking, that is designed to take ground shaking. And this is an example of that. I wanted to have you see this so you're aware that such a system exists and could be planned for in a new project. So it could be built into the building to prevent a problem later. So if you're not interested in having a new building suffer from an earthquake and leak all over the collection, making sure that the culinary water pipes, the water pipes for the toilets and the water fountains don't leak. That's a very important step and something you might not think of ordinarily. This is a shot of the Marriott Library during renovation when these structural V supports, these inverted V supports, were placed on each floor of the building to minimize the amount of motion that would occur when the building is impacted by an earthquake. This is the way it looks from inside the building. Prior to this occurring, it was actually known that the building was going to collapse if the earthquake was large enough. And so these seismic supports were all put in place. Is seen here, where the building below is moving as the Marriott Library would have moved in an earthquake prior to the installation of these inverted V braces. And here we see the V braces in place, and the building is being, the movement of the building is being minimized in a dramatic way. This is a step. The building will probably still crack in a really large earthquake, but it will not fall down, killing potentially 2,000 people on a full day. And here is a schematic of the Utah State Capitol, which was reinforced for seismic events in 2008 with new seismic perimeter interiors and interior shear walls. So this reinforcement will protect the building from collapsing, in addition to the installation of 265 seismic base isolators underneath the Capitol. So the entire Capitol was excavated out from underneath, and these were put in place. And this schematic will show you how the building motion would work. This image is of a building that is not moving on seismic isolators, and so the building moves and it causes cracks and it weakens the building dramatically. In this next image, we see the building on seismic base isolators, and the isolators are taking the motion of the ground and preventing the building itself from shaking itself and weakening all of the structures. So this base isolation is a technical possibility. Granted, it's expensive, but several buildings in Salt Lake have been treated this way to ensure that they will survive a major earthquake. And so it's a technical possibility that should be considered for very important buildings within a community. All right, back to smaller things we can consider. What about alarms and fire suppression systems? A lot of fires smolder for some time, sometimes hours, before they actually break into open flame. Given that, different types of smoke detection systems can give us an early warning that there is something going on inside the building, which is key to saving lives. This is an ionization particle smoke detector. Basically, the ions are created by a small radiation source inside of the smoke detector, and when the particles are interrupted by the smoke coming into this smoke detector, it sets off a signal. The signal can be just in the house, which will shake you out of bed in the middle of the night, wake you up, alert you to the fact that something is happening, and chase you out of the house where you won't succumb to smoke inhalation. They can also be wired to a central source of response. So the fire department can be alerted, a first responding company can get the signal, people in their homes. So on a long weekend, people on staff can be alerted that there is a smoke event occurring inside of the building and that we should really get there immediately and figure out what's going on, what is causing the smoldering, and interrupt that before it becomes an open fire. For large open spaces, for warehouse-sized storage areas, which are common for large collections, this photoelectric beam smoke detector is a very effective means of identifying a smoke problem. So the beam is essentially a laser beam being projected from one point and picked up by another, and if the signal is interrupted by smoke in between, then the alarm is signaled, and hopefully first responders will come and investigate the source. The most expensive but the most effective of the smoke detection systems is called an aspirating smoke detector. The very first of these were called VESDA systems. And this system, the little orange pipes, are actually spread out throughout a huge storage facility like a warehouse, and they sample the air and bring the samples through the system and analyze the air to find out if the particles that it's picking up are actually dust, which sometimes causes a false alarm with the two systems we just discussed, or if it's actually smoke. So the VESDA system is very specific in defining what is occurring, and in large open spaces, you can sometimes have smoldering, and it's very difficult to detect without a sampling of the actual air. It's possible to alert people outside the institution on a long weekend or over a holiday that there's been a water leak in the building. And so putting water alarms through the building can be very, very useful. But it's tricky. How do you figure out where the most likely place is for the water to collect? So we want to think about the building structure. Are the windows the most vulnerable spots in the building? Is the basement the most likely to flood if it's rising water from groundwater? So we can identify spots that will give us a signal. And again, this can be just an alarming system where it makes a noise. If someone's in the building, they'll hear it. Or it can be wired to a first responder, which is the way I would recommend it's used. A wet pipe sprinkler system is the least expensive and the most reliable of the fire suppression systems that are available on the market. All fire suppression systems are expensive, so if we had to choose between smoke detection and fire suppression, I would argue that a really good smoke detection system is worth its weight in gold if you can cut off the possibility of the fire actually occurring by getting early notification. It prevents you having to put out the fire. The wet pipe sprinkler system is designed essentially for human life safety, and it produces about 30 gallons a minute, and it's activated by actual heat up at the head, at the source of the water. 2 copper discs are soldered together, and when the temperature of the solder is reached by the flame underneath that sprinkler head, about 145 degrees Fahrenheit, the solder melts, the discs move, and then the head discharges. Each head is going to produce about 30 gallons a minute, which sounds like an awful lot of water, and it is. But compare that with the fire department, which if the firemen come in with fire hoses, each hose will produce 250 gallons per minute, and they will certainly get things wet. So the likelihood of things getting wet if you have a fire in the US is 100% if we're going to save the building at all. A way to minimize the amount of water is to use a system called a water mist fire suppression system. This one is set up to have its own standing water, which means that this is a portable system that can be placed inside of a historic home that's not even connected to a city water line. And the system is activated by this compressed gas and is forced through this head at about 5 gallons per minute. The size of the water droplets is about 1,000 microns, which is basically very small compared to the a typical wet pipe suppression system. So, but it will work in terms of being able to cool the fire and create enough moisture in the atmosphere that it cuts off the source of oxygen to the flame. There are systems that don't use water at all. This is a clean agent fire suppression system in the archives of Bern, Switzerland. So the compressed gases are either argon or nitrogen primarily, sometimes mixtures of gases. And the system works is triggered by the presence of smoke, and so an alarm would signal. The room itself would close within 30 or 40 seconds of the alarm going off, so people have time to exit the room. And then those cylinders all discharge, and within about 20 or 30 seconds, the inert gases flood the room, displacing the oxygen, therefore cutting off the ability of the fire to burn. There's so much pressure from the gas being expelled all at once that walls physically will be moved if in effect there's not a structural addition which allows the escape of some gas in the room as the pressure builds up. I was really fond of the gas systems until I found that Victaulic had invented a hybrid suppression system that combines a small amount of water with compressed gas, with nitrogen. And it's a very exciting system in that the size of the water is broken down to 10 microns, which is really, really small. And the total is only equal to about 1/4 of a gallon per minute in a closed space. Let's watch a film of this fire suppression system being tested at Brigham Young University in their library's rare book vault. So the space is a confined space. The first test just shows us what a discharge would look like. The people that are inside this vault are experiencing this, and notice it's not hazardous to their health. They can be in there, they can withstand this. In fact, they're not even getting wet. The remarkable thing is that there was not a sense of their being wet or, slightly damp, but no more than that. The walls were not wet. So that's been the discharge for the first test. And people were very excited about this. And these vaults contain hundreds of millions of dollars worth of rare material. It's an astounding collection. So now we're going to watch a full alarmed dump of this water mist, this very, very fine 10 micron size water mist filling up this vault. In this case, the vault has been emptied. In the first case, the vault was actually tested with the material inside it, which is remarkable to me. And I know this is a fairly dull slide. We're film. We're watching, it's equivalent to paint drying, essentially, but I want you to notice it takes only about a minute to completely fill this space, and that it, again, is not wetting the material that's in the space, but this is sufficient, about 1 minute later, that it will put out a flame, an open flame, when they try and light one inside the vault. So we're waiting now for the complete dump to occur. We're getting close. Watching a room fill up with steam, huh? Okay. That's about it. It's almost complete. So now the room is saturated with this very fine mist. And the first thing they're going to do is put an acetylene torch inside the room to see if the flame will continue burning.
Right out.
Went right out. So now he's going to try and relight that.
Okay.
And now that the door is open, he can't even get to the vault without it going out. And next he's going to light a piece of cellulose nitrate film, which is an extremely difficult material to put out in a fire, and burns really, really, really hot. And so he's going to put that inside the vault along with the acetylene torch, and both are extinguished almost immediately. This is a really, really remarkable system and worth your consideration if you're planning a new building. Back to simpler things, right? What can we do that's simple? Well, a simple thing is actually having access to pre-cut sheets of plastic film. We can buy rolls of this plastic sheeting in the US in a hardware store. It's used for drop cloths for painting. My lab the whole library for many years had some problems with leaking water pipes and leaking HVAC system pipes in the building. And so on weekends, we would cover up work that we were working on just to make sure that it didn't accidentally get wet over the weekend and ruin the work. Here we see an example of a flood in the BYU library some years ago that was caused by someone watering the flower bed around the building and forgetting to turn off the hose. And so the hose ran over the weekend, and by Monday morning, water is physically dripping through the light fixtures, right? So the first question is, before you go running in trying to save the books, is there an electrical shock risk if you run into that wet room with water pouring out of the electrical fixtures? And I've taken this slide to electrical engineers who've assured me that as long as the light fixture is properly grounded, there will be no risk of a person being electrocuted. The problem comes if you can't look at an electrical light fixture and know that it is grounded properly, you're at risk, which means everybody. So in this case, being careful before we start, and then covering up the stacks with plastic so that it would shed water from the point that it was applied. And it took, from the point it was discovered at about 8 a.m., it took until 1 o'clock in the afternoon before the water finally drained all the way through the building. So it prevented a large amount of the collection from continuing to get wet. And we store that pre-cut plastic, which is very carefully measured to go over the stacks and not be a trip hazard in the aisles between the ranges, so it comes right to the floor. And then we pre-fold those back into boxes and store them in discrete places throughout the collection so they're easily accessible. Another very inexpensive thing to do is fire extinguisher training. Because if we revisit this slide, I question, what is this thing on the wall? Have you personally ever used a fire extinguisher to put out a fire? You know, you may know how it works theoretically, but using one in a non-stress situation when it's not essential that you actually understand it is a great learning curve. It's a great learning adventure. And so the institution can ask the fire department to come and set a pan fire in a parking lot near the institution, and we can line up all of the staff from the building. We can get them to bring their family, and you know, it's a family event, maybe the neighbors, because the firemen love to show people how to put out a fire using a fire extinguisher, because it's not complicated, but if you've never done it, the thing looks a little bit like a bomb, and it's not complicated to learn how to pull out the pin, aim the cone of this extinguisher at the base of the fire, and pull the trigger. But doing it in the real world once gives you a feeling about how that would work, and it gives you confidence that you could actually do that if you needed to. You can get fire extinguishers from a company that is charged to refill them. So on a rotating basis, all fire extinguishers need to be recharged occasionally. And there are firms that do that work who are likely to be able to lend you 2 or 3 or 4 fire extinguishers that would be emptied anyway to be discharged in this kind of an exercise. It's great fun. You can do this every couple of years so that everyone on staff, especially the people that are part-timers and likely to be caught alone on a weekend, you know, manning the desk, maybe they would benefit tremendously from knowing how to put out a fire with a fire extinguisher. What are the steps for protecting our collection? If we get right down to brass tacks, that's really an important step. And so I like to equate this to the idea of nesting boxes within boxes like the Russian dolls to protect the inner one from whatever is on the outside that's causing the damage. And a model for this is called a hope chest in the United States. I don't know what we call them in the Philippines, but these are basically legacy chests, often made out of wood, designed for women primarily to transfer things of great value: wedding dresses, christening gowns, homemade blankets, through time. And they often sit at the foot of the bed, so they're in the human comfort zone. They have a lid on them that will shed water. It's a handmade object, so that the lid will not be airtight, so that there's a slight amount of air movement inside of the box to prevent mold growth. And the piece is, in this case, up on feet, so it's raised off the floor 3 or 4 inches, which is a very good idea in all cases. So this is a model for a thing that protects objects, and I can tell you from having seen the objects come out of a hope chest that they work great. They are made out of wood, which is acidic, which is not ideal for storing stuff, but we can wrap things before we put them in the chest to protect them from the wood itself. In the archival world or the library world, the use of prefabricated manufactured boxes works great. And the idea of putting alkaline paper folders within an alkaline paper box is a tremendous asset for storing materials. And I've seen a box directly under a water pipe that was broken shed water for 20 minutes before the water penetrated the box. So these actually will help in a direct flood situation, not for very long, it's only paperboard, but different qualities of paperboard have been used to make these boxes. And in fact, some companies now make a paperboard that has an acrylic coating that will shed more water than others. So boxes come in all different shapes, which makes it convenient for stacking things up and putting things on shelves. Some objects are really curiously shaped, so making boxes custom to fit them is an asset. And in this case, we're using coroplast, an inert material, to house this oversized book. Or in this picture, we're looking at a rare book box that was standardized by the Library of Congress for storing rare books. And these are very effective in situations with flood or fire in buffering the object from the immediate impact of the event. As I suggested earlier, we had years of floods at the Marriott Library, and so we developed this system to shed water in the photographic collection, because a wet photograph collection is a nightmare. So we've put coroplast over the top of the stacks, the top of the metal ranges, and then put these polyester, polypropylene plastic flaps on every other shelf so that the material will, the plastic will shed water in the case of a pipe leak. And that's proven to be an effective means of keeping things dry. In an earthquake zone, the idea is to keep things from rattling together and breaking. So the most fragile stuff is the priority. And I'm equating this next sequence of slides to the idea of trying to transport something fragile like an egg through time. And I was fascinated to discover that the egg carton has its origins as recently as 1911. So it's only a 100-year-old object. Before that, eggs went to market on a horse-drawn cart layered between blankets in the back of the cart. And one time that was occurring, the farmer took the eggs to market in Canada, and the hotel where he was taking the eggs refused to pay for the broken ones. And so the farmer insisted that he be paid for all of the eggs, because he was, needing to be paid for the work done. The hens had laid the eggs, he had brought them to market. And the hotel owner refused to pay for things he couldn't actually use. It caused a fight, and the newspaper man covering the story, Joseph Coyle, decided that there had to be an alternative to this craziness. And so he developed the first egg carton, which just simply separates eggs so they don't bump together on the way to market. And we now consider the egg carton standard. We buy eggs at the store and bring home an egg carton, and the cost of the carton is now worked into the price of a dozen eggs, and we don't even think about it because it makes sense to be able to get a dozen eggs home safely every time. So for the collection, the most at-risk material begins with the glass. And there are other very fragile materials, but let's start with the basics. Glass plate negatives are at risk in earthquakes because they are likely to jumble together, rattle together, fall off the shelf, and break together. So this is a system designed to protect glass plate negatives, where the glass plate, which is an image on one side of a sheet of glass, the emulsion is on one side, and the glass is on the other. It's slid into a paper sleeve to protect the emulsion from scratching, and then that paper sleeve is put inside a foam protector. These are cut to size, and the foam specifically chosen to do this is an inert material that will not degrade with time. So the foam is stable, and we're going to pack all of the glass plates in their little foam envelopes in a standard archival storage box, and we're going to put that box in, we're going to fill the box with slides of the similar sizes. There are large glass plate negatives, and we can use larger boxes to store those. But now the trick is, once padded inside of this box, how do we prevent the box from sliding off the shelf in an earthquake? Because the shelving is going to move. So in this case, we've developed this Coroplast shelf insert, and I'm going to show you the steps for making this. The boxes of glass plate negatives are stored inside of this with foam above and below and the Coroplast wrapping around it. The method for making that is to start with a sheet of Coroplast cut to the shelf size and then folded, creased, and fashioned to fit the shelf exactly. A little Velcro tab is attached to the front of the Coroplast, and the Velcro is going to be used to close the flaps of the Coroplast, not to hold it shut in an earthquake, but just to close it nicely. Foam is going to be cut that fits the exact shelving space inside the Coroplast. And again, the foam is an inert foam, guaranteed not to break down with time. Very specifically, we're choosing a foam that will not degrade. A little thumb notch is included. The system is put together where we have the foam on the bottom and the foam on the top and the foam on the front of the enclosure, and then the flaps are closed together with that Velcro, and then this shelving unit itself has metal doors that fit standard library shelving. So we went back to the shelving company, purchased doors, and these doors have a locking system with this metal rod that goes up into and down below into the frame of this, this shelving unit. And so the doors are locked with a key, in fact, so that they're shut at all times, and we have to have a key to open them and then get at the glass plates. And the theory is the shelving is bolted to the floor of the library, and so the shelving will move. The locking doors will keep the glass plate negatives in their boxes from falling on the floor, and the padding will protect the glass plates while the shaking is going on. We also have papyri in glass exhibit units, storage units like this, and they were just stored in map cases, flat file cases like this, where they're likely to vibrate, and then the vibration is going to break the glass, and then the broken glass will cut up the papyrus. So that's not so great. So we packed those in padding as well and padded out the whole drawer so that these wouldn't rattle and the drawers lock when the cabinet is closed. With paintings on the wall, all framed materials, we can ensure that they stay on the wall by using a T-lock screw and a locking plate system. Those are applied at the base of a painting, while the two top units are more simple, just a hooking device. And so the painting on the wall is placed, this part of the hook is placed over the hook that's in the wall on the top, and then on the base of the painting, this T-screw is inserted and turned such that it will enter that plate and it will be turned up and locked so that the painting in an earthquake will vibrate on the wall but not fall on the floor, in theory protecting it from being trampled when people go back into a building after the event, where the painting may now be obscured by other stuff that's fallen on top of it and be trampled further on the floor, or be subject to getting wet because pipes broke inside the building and now the painting is seriously damaged, where for $3 worth of hardware and some time to figure out how to install it on the wall, we've prevented that from happening. This is a system that was developed in 1990, which is designed to be a shelving unit with a seismic guard that can lift up off of the books to access them, and then be dropped down in place when the books are at rest, protecting the shelving unit from throwing the books on the floor during an earthquake. An inexpensive system similar to that in concept is we call the seismic shock cord. We had this developed by a local firm called Tribe One that basically deals with outdoor equipment, sporting goods and such. So this is the shelf test where they're actually rocking this piece of shelving, and the books are being rocked back and forth, but the seismic bungee cords, if you will, are attached at the base, at the edges of this shelving unit, and it's keeping the books on the shelf. Similarly, these are stored boxes full of framed glass objects, and so the seismic shock cords are fastened here, and while the shelving will move back and forth in an earthquake, we're hopeful that this will prevent damage to these glass objects. I'd like to share a complex idea now that was developed by the Getty for protecting sculpture, which I think is very interesting and has application possibly in collections that you're aware of.
What might happen to a fragile work of art during a major earthquake? The heavy carved marble sculpture, simulated here, is inherently unstable in an earthquake because of its shape and volume. Without anything to buffer an earthquake's jagged movements, the sculpture would likely topple. Even bolting it to a base, however, would not necessarily protect it during an earthquake. The best way to stabilize a sculpture like this one is to isolate it from the ground's movement. The sculpture is bolted to a base constructed of 3 individual frames. The top 2 frames slide on rollers to absorb and diffuse the Earth's movement. Springs provide resistance and act as brakes to restrain and finally slow the sliding frames. During an earthquake, the assembled frames slide independently on separate horizontal planes. An isolator does not entirely stop an object from moving. Instead, it dramatically reduces how much the force of an earthquake is transmitted to the object. The Getty Museum developed this technology and shares it worldwide. The result is works of art that are protected for all to enjoy.
Very clever system. It's taken years to develop, but you see the similarity between this and the idea of base isolators for whole buildings. So that's the first part of the talk. The second part is recovery. So given that we apparently failed to prevent the disaster from occurring, what are the priorities in recovery that we should be focused on? And the first would be water-soluble coatings. In paper, those coatings look like maybe a National Geographic magazine. It's a slick surface used for high-quality printing on papers. Not all slick surfaces on papers are water-soluble, so all of them won't be affected by water in the same way. But when that is a water-soluble coating, they're basically adhesives will soften, the pages will stick together as the paper dries, and that is called blocking, and it's not reversible, meaning books that stick together like that or film that sticks together that's been blocked together cannot actually be unblocked. You can't separate those, which is dreadful after the event. So in the case of microfilm, the idea is once the gelatin gets wet, which is holding the image on one side of the microfilm, the gelatin needs to be separated and from the contiguous roll so that it doesn't all stick together. Keeping the microfilm wet will keep the gelatin from drying. So if we just leave the microfilms in water, we can take them to a drying area, and we can just unroll them and put them on the floor with enough circulating air. That will allow them to dry. But they can also be taken to a place that processes microfilm, and they can put it back into a machine that will wash and dry the microfilm as it was in the original processing. A great secret, apparently, is that photographs that get wet, if separated immediately, will be saved. And so here we see an example of a very low-tech but very effective system of drying wet photographs, here being demonstrated in a workshop in Arizona, where the photos are taken out of the water and simply separated and placed image up so that the adhesive side of the photograph is air drying. And these photographs will not block together. They may distort, they may come up curved, they may have dirt embedded in the gelatin of the film, but just simply saving them is a huge step forward. And the reality of how quickly things will block together. If you have a box full of photographs in a basement and they get wet, it's often the case that those boxes are removed to the outside of a house or an institution while the inside is dealt with. And so the water is vacuumed up, the wet vac system is used, and we deal with the space, and by the time we get back outside to deal with the photographs, they've already blocked together. So it can happen in a matter of hours. This is a priority because photographs are really important in most collections. Photographs can be dried in a mass drying system by placing them in this configuration where there's a board on the bottom and then a blotter is inserted next to absorb the moisture from the wet photograph. Blotter is something that I have access to in my conservation lab. It may not be something that you're familiar with or have easy access to, but it's just absorbent paper board. A similar material is frankly paper towels. Paper towels are readily available and can be used here as a drying material. And also newspaper. Do not lose sight of the fact that newspaper is an extremely absorbent material. So here we could just insert newspaper for the blotter. The photograph would be placed here, or a series of photographs, and the image side would be up. On top of the image side, we'll put a sheet of Hollytex or Pellon. Pellon is the way it's labeled in the sewing store when this material is sold for sewing purposes. It's the stuff that is in the collar of my shirt to give it stiffness. It's also called Hollytex, and it's used in conservation work. So we cut it to size, but Pellon is very inexpensive. It's like $1 or $2 a yard, maybe $2 a yard. So we can buy it and cut it to fit, cut it to size. Again, a layer of blotter on top of this sandwich, or paper towel or newsprint, and it could be printed newsprint, and then a board and then a weight. And so the way this looks in practice is Jeff has got the blotter up on top here. What we're drying here is a piece of paper that has a coating on it. It's a book jacket with a slick surface that is water soluble. So Jeff has made a stack of these book jackets, put Hollytex below and on top of the book jacket, and then blotter above and below, making a sandwich that will absorb the moisture once it's closed up. Here he closes up the stack by putting a board on top and adding some pressure. And so we'll leave it sit like that, and the water transfers from the wet photograph or the wet book jacket into the blotter. It will penetrate through the Hollytex into the blotter because Hollytex or Pellon is a water-permeable material. Then the blotter gets taken out maybe a day later, and we dry the blotter and reuse it. But if we're using newsprint, we'll just throw it away and use some dry newsprint, and we'll recycle this whole stack of materials again to be dried a second time. And it typically takes 3 or 4 times to dry a stack of wet material like this. But it's effective and it saves square footage because we're now piling things up as we dry them. In the case of a full-on flood, we may consider pack-out. Moving the collection to another space is not without its risks, but it may be very important. If an entire basement floods, you should probably have thought about the possibility of that occurring and where you might move material. Things that can happen, though, are, there are lots of other problems that can occur. If the collection includes a piano, for instance, and the basement is flooded, the question of moving the piano up a bunch of bad stairs to get it outside may be beyond the capacity of the people doing the recovery, in which case you might A, need a specialist to help you, or B, just ignore the piano because the other parts of the collection will get priority by default based on the complexity of the problem of moving a piano. If we take a bunch of collection material out of the building, where are we going to put it that it will be secure, that it will be environmentally protected, and that we can allow it to dry? Those are all questions that need to be answered well in advance before we start taking things out. So if possible, we'll probably dry things on site, but it's possible that we could move them either to a different room or to a different building altogether. If we're moving books, the idea of putting them in prefabricated cardboard boxes of similar size allows us to stack the boxes, and we'll line them with a black plastic garbage bag that creates a barrier so the wet books will not cause the box itself to get wet and therefore lose its physical strength. When we move the material out of the building, we want to put it in a place that's going to be safe, and we're going to need to get at some of it as we're drying it because of a variety of problems that may arise. So we're going to carefully mark what comes out of the building in what sequence and where it was originally so that we can start to track back to identify where the material might be. This is actually a photograph of a flood that occurred in Fort Collins, Colorado. Colorado State University had a major flood at one point, and 425,000 books got wet in one night. So this is the beginning of a multi-year project to remove the books and to dry them. Where will things go? Well, we might put them in an adjoining building if we have access to that. We can ask permission in advance if we think there are possibilities, for instance, of sharing a couple of rooms within an adjoining museum that would be a partner with us in the case of, in case they needed to use our facility. It would be an exchange basis. We can build a drying facility on site, and possibly that is an expedient answer. When we're taking the material out of the building, we will buy time by freezing it. Freezing is basically an interim step that allows us to minimize the damage to the wet material. There are questions about whether or not we can freeze all materials, and there are debates about this. Some types of photographs may be damaged by freezing, and there are other specific types of materials, ivory, that might be damaged by freezing. But I would like to venture that as a general rule, as a principle, most materials can be frozen. And if we're dealing with a wide range of things that have all gotten wet at once, slowing down to try and determine which thing is wet and what type of media it is not the proper step. We should probably freeze everything and have done that kind of planning on a dry day in advance. If you identify specific materials that would be high-risk materials if they were wet or frozen, and typically if they're wet is the key, those should be packaged better. Those should be considered for maybe getting another layer of protection in the current storage so that they would not be subject to getting wet in the first place. This is Jerzy Palaczynski in the Czech Republic during major flooding in Europe that affected multiple nations. He's putting books into a chest freezer, which is one means of freezing material and stopping the water damage at the point that it is. This is the cold storage facility at the British Library. When they built their new building, they actually built a flash freezer into the building. That's how frequent the flooding is in libraries. It's a known quantity. Flash freezing is a great advantage in that it creates smaller ice crystals, but in practice, getting access to a flash freezer is very difficult if you don't build it into your own facility. So commercial freezing facilities work, and they're available, and we can pre-identify sources of freezing that are close and that are further away. Sometimes freezers are full because of the cycle of, here during deer hunt season, the freezers are full. So we want to be able to rely on other freezers that are maybe outside the immediate area if we need them. This is a slide from inside the freezers in Wyoming where the books from Colorado State University were taken. The drive was about an hour and a half from the library flood, and they were stored in these on pallets that were, prepared to stack 4 pallets high in this commercial freezer plant, and they remained there frozen until they were taken to Fort Worth, Texas for vacuum freeze drying, and we'll discuss that in a minute. Notice that the frozen books, which are molded, the mold started in day 3 in the Colorado State University flood, and it progressed for 14 days until the pack-out was complete. So the books got worse as the pack-out continued. So these books are pretty moldy, and they're in a commercial freezer next to frozen peas. So I asked the freezer manager, well, what about the frozen peas? And he said, I'm not worried about it. They were sealed before they got in here. And I'm sure he's right, but I never eat frozen peas without thinking about this slide. So at one point, it was a question for a team of people that I was associated with as to what kind of damage or how damaging are the different drying and sterilization techniques. So we did an experiment that included the British Library and the Czech National Library and a bunch of folks in the US to compare the drying and sterilization techniques. And so the first technique that's the most common and people think of as the most inexpensive, but truly a very labor-expensive process is air drying. So these are books that are being dried at Beauvoir in Biloxi, Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina in the upstairs part of that presidential library. There was not a lot of dry space available to us, so we're using every available option, which includes putting plastic sheeting on these chairs to keep the water from damaging the chair, and then just trying to spread out as much as possible the wet material. This occurs in August and September. It's an extremely hot time of year, and it was very hot after the storm. And so the building has got a lot of air circulation because of the broken windows and such, and things are drying out nicely. This is Gary Frost, the conservator that we met before from Iowa, who is busy drying books and documents in a rare book facility elsewhere along the coast in Mississippi. And notice that the materials are suffering from some mold and water damage, but as much as possible, we're separating them, allowing air flow to evaporate the water from these materials. And we're spreading out books and paintings that got wet. Here in my lab, we're separating books with what's called a vellum binding comb. It's a plastic piece that looks like a comb that we use on the top of the book to fan out the pages. And the most important component here is the fans, that the more air circulation that we can generate, the faster the drying will occur. We can manage maybe 100 books being dried at one time, maybe 150 books, but at some point it's exhausting trying to keep track of what is the different state of dryness for each of these books in the room. So we evaluate that every day to see what's dry, and in the meantime, if this is 150 books and there are 1,500 books to deal with, the rest of the books sit in the freezer waiting for a chance to be thawed and spread out and dried like this. We can preferentially dry the bindings by opening them up like this to increase airflow, or in the case of large books, heavy paper, we can separate the pages with, again, these Vellum binding combs to increase airflow and maximize the drying. The problem with paper getting wet, of course, is that it cockles when it dries. So paper expands when it gets wet, and it shrinks when it dries. Machine-made papers do have a grain direction that makes this swelling and shrinking process very visibly evident. And so we see cockling as a very big issue. And the cure for that, when possible, is that we air dry the material so that it's dry to the touch, and we physically feel the back of the book edge. We run our hand in and feel for wetness. If it's still wet back there, you can't press it yet. And especially if it's a coated stock paper, those have to be separated. Every single leaf of coated stock paper has to be separated. And sometimes books have images. Books from the 1930s, for instance, have a set of 8 or 9 plates that are all on coated stock in the middle of the book. Those all need to be separated, where the other pages of the book not being coated will not need to be separated. In any case, as the book dries out, maybe on the 3rd day we can feel that it's getting dry. We can press the book overnight, minimizing the distortion by putting it under pressure, and then the next day open the book up and allowing air flow to dry the book further, and then again that night we'll press the book. And so we'll start to alternate between drying and pressing the book until it's completely dry, at which point we will press it for some time. So the pressure allows us to minimize the distortion. So that is maybe, that's the best we can do with air drying. And air drying can be like this, where we set up lines and we attach things either over the line or clip them to the clotheslines that can fill up the room this way. We can set things out just to be air dried, separating framed material from the frames and in fact from the matting may be useful. Understanding clearly that if you've not handled wet material of this sort before, learning on a wet painting is no time for beginning to understand how the frame system works. Getting a framer involved in the drying process may be a key to minimizing damage to the pieces. But the frame will hold the water inside the package, and so if it's a glass frame, it may create a mold space. And so we want to think about preventing that from occurring by opening things up. By creating a hyper-dry space, we accelerate the drying. So by lowering the relative humidity in this abandoned grocery store in Ontario, Canada, the Archives of Canada, which flooded one Christmas, had 20,000 boxes of archival material get wet one evening. And so they froze the material and then moved it into this space. These are desiccant dehumidifiers. That's what this is. And the dry air is being moved inside of this grocery store space. A desiccant dehumidifier works by taking wet air, which in that case would be just outside air, and running it through a desiccant dehumidification wheel. A desiccant is those salts that we see in little paper or little containers inside of our pills. So like in a vitamin bottle, there's a little desiccant there that will preferentially absorb the moisture in the bottle of vitamins, preventing the pills from sticking together because they got wet. So this wheel is a desiccant, so the air is forced through this wheel and is stripped of moisture. The moisture is condensed and then is separated out from the air and is expelled from the dehumidifier. And the dry air at about 25% relative humidity is put back inside the building. And so these tubes are now pushing desiccated air, 25% relative humidity air, into the building of the library at Colorado State University. When the entire basement was flooded, the 4 stories above the basement were subject to molding because the building was hermetically sealed by windows that don't open. So we had to dry the spaces inside the library that were not affected directly by the flood, but in fact were humid enough that the books were starting to warp a bit. This, back into Ontario, this is the inside of that abandoned grocery store where temporary shelving has been set up and the archives material is taken out of the frozen boxes, allowed to thaw and spread out on these shelves. The air is being moved around and it's being continually re-dried by those desiccant dehumidifiers outside the space. And the space can be used to dry all kinds of things: cassette tapes, negatives from film prints, sound recordings, which are magnetic media, etc. So creating a drier space will accelerate the rate of drying. As the material was dried, it was put back into new, undamaged archival quality folders and put into new boxes. The labeling from the old material was saved so that it could be transferred to the new boxes, and on we go. Another method for drying, which is no longer in favor but had been used in the Florence flood, is thermal drying. And so in the experiment that we were running, we wanted to see how thermal drying stacked up against other drying methodologies. So in the Czech Republic, we were able to get access to a drying kiln that was used for drying lumber. And inside this kiln, we put wet books that were standardized. We used a standard method of wetting and draining books before trying to dry them by the various methods. And these books are being stacked on ceramic tiles that are separated by a sheet of Hollytex to keep any publisher's cloth binding material from adhering to the tile. And on top of the stack of books is a brick for weight to help with the distortion. The kiln was sealed up, and we'll look at the results when we get to them. The standard for drying things en masse in libraries and archives these days is vacuum freeze drying. And here we see Kirk Lively in the process of rolling a rack of books to be dried inside of a vacuum freeze drying chamber. He actually designed this. He's an engineer. So the steel chamber has metal ribs that keep the box itself from imploding when we apply a vacuum, when we pull a vacuum inside the box. The books themselves can be given some form by wrapping them, putting boards on either side of them and wrapping it with Velcro to give it some pressure so that they dry a little bit flatter. And then the vacuum is pulled inside of the vacuum freeze drying chamber, and a little bit of heat is added, which causes sublimation. Inside of a vacuum, water cannot exist. If we could be on a space station and open the back door and throw a glass of water out into space, the water would become ice and or steam. It cannot survive in a vacuum in a water form. So inside of this vacuum freeze drying chamber in Fort Worth, Texas, we pull a vacuum, which would cause all of the books that were wet to freeze. We speed the process up by freezing them in advance, putting the frozen books in this chamber, adding a little bit of heat, which causes sublimation. And so the ice is converted to gas, which collects on the back of the machine's a heat plate on the back of the machine. And the books are dried. And it depends how wet they are, but it may take a week. If they're being constrained by that Velcro strap, they take longer to dry. Therefore, the cost is increased, but the product at the end is better by drying them under pressure. At the British Library, those books that were frozen in the flash freezer are dried in a small Vertus vacuum drying system, and they've included a pressure source here, a little jack that they can open. They'll jack up the pressure and put these books in the vacuum freeze drying chamber, pull a vacuum and dry them for a couple of days, and open up the chamber again and check on their progress, and then reassert the pressure. Because the ice is sublimating, there's more give in that stack. There's more space that's being created as the ice sublimates. So we want to jack it up nice and tight and then put this back into under pressure to sublimate some more. And over time, this dries out and is very effective. Vacuum packing is a system that's really quite interesting in that we are putting an absorbent material every so often in a bunch of, in a book. So within every 6 leaves or so in the book, we'll place a dry piece of paper. In this case, we're using newsprint that's actually printed, and we get very little offset of the ink. If you're worried about that, certainly you can use clean, new, unprinted newsprint or blotter, but in fact, this is a very effective system. We're interleaving the book every few leaves, placing newspaper around the outside of the book as an absorbent material, and putting the whole thing inside of a bag that is closed up with this vacuum suction machine, which sucks all of the air out of the bag, creating a vacuum. So the vacuum pulls the bag very snugly around this book, causing a lot of pressure, which under pressure allows the water in the pages of the book to be transferred by capillary action to the dry material. And so what was dry newsprint becomes wet over time. In a few days, we'll open the bag back up, take the wet newsprint out, replace it with dry newsprint, and seal the bag back up. This process may take 20 exchanges of paper if the material is very dry, but over time it becomes dried and flat. It's really a lovely system because it combines pressure during the drying process. So drying a thing under pressure is the optimal way to go when possible. And the fact that we're actually pulling a vacuum inside the bag prevents mold from growing. So we can leave one of these bags sitting untended for quite a while. Sterilization is not something that we'll enter into lightly. It's definitely going to impact the material that we're treating, so we want to be very thoughtful about this. But in the case of a community-wide flood, when there's standing water in a community, it causes sewage to rise. Sewer systems are gravity-driven systems, and so the standing water impacts that, and the sewage will rise. Therefore, it will be mixed with the standing water inside the collections, possibly, and can be a health risk later once we take the material out of the floodwater and dry it. So we have to at least consider the possibility that we will need sterilization. So we experimented with that in our study. The 2 primary systems for sterilizing materials that are available to us in the United States include gamma radiation, and that works by putting materials such as books, for instance, that were flood damaged into these bins, and the bins travel inside of this machine past lead-lined walls where they're exposed to a radiation source. The radiation penetrates the bin completely, and then the bins come out of the machine, and basically the radiation has traveled right through the material and killed all of the living matter that was in it. This is an ethylene oxide machine. Basically, the system here is that a vacuum is pulled inside of this machine, and a gas is used to sterilize all of the material. Ethylene oxide is very deadly poison. which is permitted to penetrate all parts of the book because it's being placed in a vacuum. So the ethylene oxide penetrates the whole book. After the exposure, the material is set aside to equilibrate, and basically the off-gassing process completely neutralizes the ethylene oxide, and after a 24-hour period, the material is safe to be handled. Both types of sterilization are handled by firms licensed to do this work. It's not casual work. It's actually handled under very tight specifications. Both systems have serious consequences for people, and so they're handled very carefully. And we'll look at the outcomes from that testing here in a moment. So the outcomes physically from the drying techniques are seen here in 5 similar books that were wetted by different means. This is an air-dried book that has some distortion. These first 5 books are all machine-made papers, and so cockling is more evident in the machine-made paper, and therefore the distortion is to be expected. This is a vacuum freeze-dried book where there is greater distortion visible. The third is a thermal-dried book, and it may or may not be very clear for you to see on your computer screen, but the edge of this book is actually browner than the other books that we're comparing, and that is because under the heat system, the cellulose is being aged. It's artificially aging the book and deteriorating it by cooking it, essentially. This is a vacuum-packed book, and the result is actually quite acceptable. And just a technique I didn't describe thoroughly here in this talk was done with a vacuum press, which is basically just a baby version of a vacuum packing system. The next 5 books are handmade papers. The machine-made paper begins with the development of a paper-making machine in England in 1799 as a design, and by 1803 the first paper-making machine is working. By about 1840 or 1850, machine-made paper is basically displacing handmade paper as the most available material, and it's cheaper. So it's definitely in play. These books are all pre-1800, and that's a good rule of thumb. Books prior to 1800 are going to all be handmade paper. And here again we see the air-dried book, which is being squeezed in between drying steps. Looks very good. The vacuum freeze-dried book looks fine. The thermal-dried book again looks browner on the edge because it's basically cooked. And the vacuum-packed book looks amazing. It's quite wonderful, as well as vacuum press book. We compared the books for their physical deterioration. We wanted to measure the page strength as a result of our testing, and we found that the drying methods, by and large, were identical. There's noise in our data, meaning when we're working with books from the real world, differences in paper can occur within even one book, much less comparing books of different printings in a study like this. But we really wanted to use books from the real world to see how real world materials reacted. And so air drying and vacuum packing and freeze drying all did extremely well in this study. The yellow line is non-damaging, is a 0 line essentially. And ethylene oxide comes out completely undamaging to paper. On the other hand, thermal drying was measured to be 20% weaker after the treatment than before it was dried. And gamma radiation after the treatment was 25% weaker. So both of those methods are essentially physically damaging to material. So while they may be useful for drying material that has essentially a determined short shelf life, we know, for instance, it'll be thrown away in 20 years, fine. But for permanent retention material, I strongly recommend you avoid gamma radiation and thermal drying, but the other methodologies we tested were just fine. Sometimes we need to remove soot from a damaged collection. This next slide is the New Mexico State University's library in Albuquerque. This is the result of an arson-related fire. It's known that arson is actually responsible for almost 50% of the institutional fires in collecting institutions. So often, in fact, with a fire, if there's arson involved, we know the perpetrator, a person who's either been inside the building at some point, is a disgruntled patron, is an angry employee that's maybe no longer working there. But the arson is a big, big problem. The nature of the fire was that it was set in the basement where there was no fire suppression system, where the floors above had a fire suppression system in place. So this was very calculated. And the damage that occurs in a fire, post-fire, is that the smoke and the uncombusted parts of the fire, when a building burns, everything doesn't burn completely and turn to carbon, but the carpeting is partially consumed by the fire, but only partially. The adhesives behind the carpeting, the paint on the walls, the wooden furniture, all of this material burns to a certain extent and creates soot, which is not dust, but is this uncombusted byproduct of the fire that is very gummy and over time sticks more and more aggressively to the cultural property that we want to salvage. This is a picture of record books in a place called the Sevier County Archive. It's the record books for Sevier County. The fire occurred in the attic. It was based on a welder's spark. So sometimes inadvertent accidents happen around building construction events. And the fire burned up in the attic and then put itself out due to a lack of oxygen and material to burn. But all of the soot from that fire filtered down into the archive. So this material smells of smoke and is discolored from the soot. It's hard to tell from that picture. So the methods that are used for cleaning soot from burnt material include natural rubber soot sponges, which are used just to wipe over the surface of the walls and furniture to remove the soot. The nature of those rubber sponges that it's kind of gummy and the soot will adhere to it. We tear the sponge open to get a nice clean layer of sponge to work with, and we throw the sponge away when we're done, and it's a very effective method for removing soot. In this particular case, we experimented with what's called dry ice misting. Dry ice is an interesting material to use for this purpose in that it's extremely cold. The machine itself is designed to take a block of frozen CO2, seen here, and grind it up about the size of sugar. And that ground up CO2 is extremely cold, and it's pushed at about somewhere between 15 pounds per square inch and 40 pounds per square inch through this nozzle. And the cold, dry ice crystals, these little pieces of dry ice about the size of sugar, hit the book, preferentially freezing the area that they've come in contact with, and expand in size about 800 times the original size. So they're both warming up in the surrounding atmosphere and expanding, but they're preferentially freezing the soot on the surface of the book. Seen here, left side is cleaned and right side still has the soot in place. It's a very effective method. It's tricky to use. A person has to be well trained in the application of dry ice misting, and the system can be a bit abrasive if it's used incorrectly. So here, the amount of time that the dry ice was focused on this part of the book cloth was sufficient to abrade it. It acts like sandpaper if it's in contact with the book cloth long enough or close enough. And here we remove part of the stamping on the spine. And so those are the first two sections of this talk, and I'm going to close with a discussion of mold. And I appreciate your patience. This is a really important topic because, in fact, I don't think mold is really well understood, but it's a fascinating part of the planet. Mold is not the same as plants. It's actually its own separate category of material, and we see it here pulled out, and it represents about 3.5% of the living organisms on Earth, right? Animals are almost 20% of the living organisms on Earth, and plants are about 18%. Insects are over 50% of the different types of living creatures on the planet. The fungi and the molds are everywhere. They exist in the tropics, in the center of the planet, and they exist at the poles. There are lots of different kinds. In fact, there are probably thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of different varieties of mold that have yet to be identified, that are very specific subspecies, but it's complicated with the molds. And so we're still in an early phase of understanding how diverse this material is. They are fascinating as visual objects, and of course, they're very damaging to cultural property. So we want to think about what are the triggers that activate a mold event. And I figured out this funny little triangle that includes the idea of food, so the cultural property itself, books or textiles, for instance. The amount of time since the environment shifted such that it became an activator for the mold. Those make up the other two legs of this triangle. The environment is critical. The amount of moisture in the air is certainly a key part of what causes mold, but it's too simplified to believe that 65% relative humidity, for instance, is going to cause a mold event. And I've read that in the literature for years. I bet it's more humidity in the Philippines today than 65%. And so in theory, according to that published statement, the whole Philippines should be engulfed in mold, but it's not true. So the question is, when there's an environmental condition that will sustain mold growth and be able to feed it, what is the amount of time? This is kind of the moving variable between when this shift occurs and when the mold starts. So if you think about opening a can of or a jar of applesauce, we open the jar of applesauce, it's sealed under pressure, we open it and there is an influx of air. We have some applesauce for dinner, it's delicious. And we put it in the refrigerator and we have some more 5 days later. We open the jar back up, everything is fine. Then we put the jar away and we forget that the applesauce is there, and at some point in the future, we do remember it, and we open it up and we see, oh, we've gone too long, the mold is forming. What caused the mold to form, and when did that exactly start to happen? Did that happen at day 10 or day 14? This is in refrigeration, so, what does the temperature have to do with when this kicked over? We have a lot of unknowns, but we know for a fact there is mold, and it does occur, and we're constantly figuring it out. So I'd like to figure it out in terms of when we might expect a mold bloom in our cultural property. There was a study done in 1999 by Hoka and Vitanen that suggests that there are indicators of mold being in process, that we can determine with magnification, with a microscope, that there is a period of no mold growth. And then the first three categories are periods of time where the mold is beginning to form, but we can't see it visually. There is no evidence around us. In fact, the applesauce wouldn't look like it was molding. And then all of a sudden, there seems to be mold. And it's just a little bit, of course, at first, and then it grows, and beyond a certain point, we're unwilling to eat the applesauce, and shouldn't. But there is this transitional period. And so I question, what exactly is this catalyst that's causing mold to grow? So a living example of this for me was the Biloxi Public Library after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We got access to the library 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. So we're now inside of this building that is a couple of blocks from the Gulf Coast, so it's not directly on the Gulf, but it did have this large inundation of pine needles. So the water washed through the building, and there's like 1.5 foot of pine needles underfoot. So walking around inside of this space is like walking on a mattress. It's very surreal. Some of the windows were blown out, and so there's airflow through this space, which caused the pine needles to dry. Downstairs, there was an exhibit case, a glass case up on a steel frame, so it's not in contact with the floor, but inside the closed space of this glass exhibit case, there are baskets, woven baskets, that are completely engulfed in mold. There is no active water inside the case. It's just the high humidity trapped inside of the airspace, and it's only about 10 inches of airspace in there, but this glass case is fully engulfed in mold. Similarly, in the rare book area of the Biloxi Public Library, inside of the map drawers, right, opening the drawers up, we saw a horrible looking mass of mold growing. So the drawer itself is starting to form signs of rust. This is 21 days after the storm. And we saw inside of a file cabinet this book molding badly inside of a Tyvek envelope. This is a plastic Tyvek that was preventing airflow, where the other books in the same file cabinet that were stored in paper folders were not engulfed in mold. So now that gives us a point of variability. We got a Tyvek envelope that's molding badly, the contents are molding badly, and paper envelopes that are not molding at all. So what is the variable? And I think it has something to do with air movement. I think the applesauce inside of the refrigerator, while cold, is subject to a lack of air flow. And that once the mold is able to be catalyzed, will be a deciding factor. For instance, have you ever been inside of a natural cave and noticed that the cave has air motion? This is a park ranger in the United States who is standing by one vent out of a cave that's breathing. It has physical air movement from the front of the cave out this vent, this side part of the vent, and they call it breathing. Have you ever noticed inside of a cave? For those of you that have been in a cave, it's a wonderful experience, tremendous. If you've never been inside one, I encourage you to get the chance at some point. Take it, go and see. There's a lot of water involved in some caves. There are dripping stalactites and stalagmites on the floor of the cave, where the water dripping is causing the growth and the deposition of minerals that is causing that growth. I've been in caves that have entire lakes underground inside of the cave, but I have not seen a mold bloom inside of these caves. Caves are very strange, but they don't include a mold bloom. And there is this slight air flow that's passing over that lake of water and past those dripping stalactites that seems to play a role. And when you think about it, my lungs, though I'm breathing 3 to 5 spores per hour on average all of my life, my lungs, which are warm, they're wet, they're dark, they're, it's a humid tropical environment inside of my lung, and my lungs are not engulfed in mold. And I think that is an indicator that mold itself is triggered by a combination of events because it has a purpose on the planet. What is it doing here? Why are all the insects here, by the way? And what the heck is the mold for? Well, mold can be harnessed to make cheese and make wine, that's certain. But I think it's part of the planet's makeup to ensure that the planet is clean and that material that dies is recycled into carbon so it can regenerate living material again. The planet is an extremely complicated ecological system, and the mold plays a big part in keeping things that are dead under control. The molds eat the dead stuff, and I think all of those different varieties of molds are keyed up to prefer certain types of materials that die and or appear dead to the mold. So I'm going to anthropomorphize mold for a minute and think of it as a living critter that has a personality. And first off, equate it with the idea that if we're going to have a picnic on the planet and we want to be sure not to have ants at the picnic, the proper step is not to use pesticides all around the picnic area to make darn sure that the ants are dead. Don't do it. It's bad form. You don't want to eat the poisons. They're not, and there is no defeating all of the ants on the planet. They're here with us. They're part of us. It's part of a holistic system. So killing it doesn't make any sense. And killing a species of life, a type of living creature on the planet because it is affecting your cultural property doesn't make any sense either. The molds are ubiquitous on the planet Earth, and they're here for a purpose. It's part of the holistic approach that the planet has taken to ensuring its own future, that it cleans itself as things age and die and are recycled back into part of the living structure of the planet. So we have to think strategically about learning to live with the mold. And you can do this if you get organized. This is a picture, a drawing from 1969 from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the purpose of this storage bin, this storage unit, is to contain freshly picked high moisture corn and to prevent it from molding in storage. And so we're going to fill up this bin with corn, fresh corn, which is full of water, but we're going to supply a forced air source at the base of this storage unit that will rise and exit the unit, taking moisture with it. The movement of air moves moisture around, and doing that, I think, triggers a sensibility in the mold, if you will, that says, we're not dead here. Not dead yet. We don't need your services. Don't bother. This place is fine. Keep moving. And so this is a drying system, an ecologically sound drying system that works to preserve corn. If we're going to mitigate mold in our buildings, we have to think about how does our building fit into this bigger environment where there are living organisms that can become problematic, right? So if we're busy putting stuff inside of those packages I'm talking about, those boxes, we might want to be careful, especially in the Philippines in a high humidity environment, using plastics to store stuff. That Tyvek envelope should be a red flag for everybody listening to this talk. Plastics will contain moisture and not allow things to breathe, will not allow it's not a permeable membrane where a paper surface is. So paperboard boxes that are not airtight are probably a much better choice than a plastic bin that, yes, will shed water in a flood, but may also cause mold on its own to grow inside of that still, stayed environment. So inside of a building that is having a mold event, we're going to need to start with the premise that the free water in the building needs to be eliminated. So things that are causing the water in the building include roof leaks, right? After a big storm, maybe the roof has been damaged. They can include downspouts, the way rain is shed off of a building and is deposited at the edge of the building. Maybe the downspout needs to be extended out 4 or 5 or 10 feet to move the water from the surface of the roof away from the base of the building so that the walls of the building are not wet. And it's possible that we're going to need to construct a drainage system outside a pre-existing building, such as a French drain, which is essentially just digging down to below the base line of the building to lower than the lowest part of the, if it's a concrete slab, to the lowest part of that concrete slab, and then putting permeable material like rocks, different size rocks, building up a drainage system that will move moisture from the building into that drainage system because the rocks are lower and then the base of the building, and move the water away from this building. So that's a structural improvement that can be designed and implemented. It's expensive, but if your building is leaking or molding inside, you may have to really consider what's going to prevent that mold bloom. When we're actively experiencing a mold bloom, simply putting fans in the room to dry the air might be problematic in that now everything is actually blooming, and the way mold moves from place to place is by aerial aeration. So moving from one spot of the building to another would be accelerated if we have fans blowing the spores, which are now occurring regularly as the bloom is engaged, to different parts of the building. Unaffected parts are now going to be full of mold spores. So running the air out of the building, certainly circulating air will help dry the space, but running the air out of the building, possibly through a HEPA filter that will grab the mold spores on the way out of the building, is preferred. We need to aerate the rooms. We need to aerate the building. Some buildings, I'm currently giving this talk inside of a building that is hermetically sealed. It's 5 stories and the windows don't open, and it's designed to be powered, to be environmentally controlled by an air conditioning system or a heating system every day of the year. It's not designed to be aeration from room to room or from the outside into the building. In a building like this, when we have a water problem, it absolutely has to be dealt with in a contained way. We have to either dry the building from dehumidification, such as those dehumidifiers that were positioned outside the building in an earlier slide. We have to move air within the building to draw off the water from whatever is wet. So we can dehumidify, we can aerate, and once we have dried the building, once we have created enough airflow and eliminated the source of the moisture, the source of the event that's causing this mold bloom, the mold will desiccate. The mold will, in fact, become inactive. It doesn't die. The mold is always with us. So the mold is on the planet forever and 24/7. It's inactive usually, but it's in the air and it's moving around, different species, different varieties. But the catalyst has changed. The air is in motion, the humidity is being lowered, and so the mold basically gets a signal, I'm not needed now. I will go into a hibernation state, and it goes to sleep. It doesn't have to be killed. It will go to sleep on its own. But Lowering the humidity is a big part of that. Moving the air around is a big part of that. Cutting off the sources of water that are going to create that bloom are a big part of that. And once the mold desiccates, we can remove it, and I'll show you pictures. So we want to cut off the source of the water, fix the roofs. If the water is coming through the walls, we want to identify exactly where the water is with water meters and figure out how are we going to dry that. Is running a fan inside of that room going to be sufficient, or do we need to actually create a French drain outside the building, create a separation from the outside ground, which is very wet, move water away from the building? Inside the building, we need to move air around. And if the room is very moldy, we need to move air in one direction and through a set of HEPA filters and out of the building so as not to impact the entire building. In Hurricane Katrina, we actively went around to small museums that got wet during the storm and opened up windows to create air circulation so that the drying would start to occur and the mold would start to stop. We would actively begin the end of the bloom cycle by creating improved circulation. And we can do that with cross ventilation, so having air come in one part of the building, possibly with, in the wind direction, and then move through the building and have a point of escape. And we can even structure that such that there's a large inlet in the building and a smaller one, sort of like a chimney, but in another wall. Works fine, but chimneys are based on this theory that we start with one size and move the air up and out of the building, again, creating airflow. What is required in the cave system is a large opening at one end and small openings at the back of the cave, and that's sufficient to draw the air through the cave, in which case air movement is enough to keep mold from blooming. And when we've actually had a bloom, getting the mold to dry first. If you touch the mold and it's still active, it's still green, if you will, it will smear and not move. But as seen in this illustration here, the mold is actually so dry, it can just be moved aside like dust. It basically is desiccated and can be removed either with a vacuum cleaner that has a HEPA filter at the back of the vacuum to remove that mold. And in this case, what we're seeing is the staining that occurs from the mold digesting the cellulose of this paper. The mold is eating the paper. It's preferentially having lunch. And so it thinks the paper is dead. And so what we have to do is convince it this paper is still being prized. It's still a living treasure. Please don't eat the paper. We accept the staining. If it's a Rembrandt print, it's possible to remove stains from something, but it's very time-consuming, it can be very tricky, and it can be expensive. So for most library and archival material, we simply accept the fact that it has history of mold. It's part of its story, and we accept the staining. We want to treat mold with respect. Some people are more susceptible to disease from mold than others, and so we want to protect them. If someone says they're not the person to do this kind of work, believe them. I think it's probable that you can find somebody else. We're now cleaning this mold off of the top of this book inside of a fume hood, which gives us ventilation out of the building. But if you don't happen to have a nice fume hood to work with, you can simply take a book outside of the building with the air coming over your shoulder so you're not going to breathe the spores in, and using a soft brush, just brush the spores away. The desiccated spores will be removed. And the purpose of that is so that the person handling the book next, if they're susceptible to mold as a problem, if there's an allergic reaction to mold, they won't be facing a whole bunch of dried out, inactive, yet still moldy material. The desiccated mold will be removed, the staining will be still in place. But this is an approach to mold that does not include trying to kill it, but trying to learn to live with it and by the rules that it lives by. So with that, I am going to conclude this talk. I am grateful for your attention today. I will be with you momentarily in a live conversation to answer questions and to talk with you. But this is pre-recorded in the hopes that we could get a good, clean projection there today. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll now go to questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Randy. That was very, very informative. I know a lot of our participants are taking down notes. And even the people here in our webinar Zoom and even the panelists are also taking down notes. Okay, just a reminder to all our participants. By the way, we have almost 300 participants in Zoom, and there are almost 300 people watching in YouTube, and also same number in our Facebook page. So please, for those participants who would like to ask questions, you could visit Slido and use the code disaster15. Okay, you may also use the QR code shown on screen so you can see it there. Okay, so in Slido, you can upvote the questions or you can reply to a question if you have a follow-up question to that question. Okay, all right. Randy, are you ready? We received a number of questions, and I know you would really like to interact with our audience. So let me start with, okay, this is the most upvoted question, Randy. For libraries with no budget for preservation, what alternative practical methods can they use? No.
Right, right. We don't have a lot of money.
That's right.
In fact, I have never met an institution that told me that they had too much money. So I even heard people at the Getty Museum tell me that they're struggling. They don't have enough money. And I think, well, compared to what? So there are always slight improvements. And if I was in an institution that didn't have any money and I had cultural material that was important, I would try to do things that were common sense. I wouldn't buy any stuff to put on things. I don't believe in all of that. I think that the common sense things have been done over time. So if you don't know what some of those are, we should talk with your grandparents. Your grandma knows this, but she doesn't talk to you about it because you've never asked her. But let's ask grandma, because grandma maybe inherited a dress or a christening gown or some the family Bible. There are things that people pass down through time and they give to a person to take care of for the family, and then grandma's going to leave it to somebody, and she's going to want to have a conversation about what did she know about taking care of it and what did she learn on the way. So a common sense thing, this is a simple answer, but things come down to us through time a lot. Not everything makes it, but some stuff does. It mostly didn't burn up. It mostly didn't get flooded and destroyed, you know? And so what kind of care do you have to take to make sure that the dog doesn't get it and chew it up, right? If you're in a library, if it's a physical building, how can we be sure that the roof is good, that the roof isn't going to leak, that the building fires are set by people for a variety of reasons, but half of the fires in the US in cultural institutions started with arson. That's a terribly mean thing to do. So if you're trying to preserve stuff and you're trying hard to take care of this like a baby, and somebody comes and sets your building on fire, it isn't going to help you take care of it. It's going to be really awful. So what can we do, And so I'm not giving you a straight answer. I'm giving you just a thought on this subject. I'd like to give you an example of here's an idea. We have rock art in Utah. That these are and in Utah there's two kinds of rock art. There's the rock art that's chipped into the wall, so ancient images that are somewhere between 600 and 1,000 years old. And then there are really old ones, 2,000 years old, that are painted on the walls in yellows and reds. They're really strange. They look like spacemen, and they're gorgeous. And one panel, and the problem with rock art is it's right out in the middle of nowhere. It's open to the public. And this one panel was one of the most defaced panels. It was known to be one of the most defaced panels in the US. People had come over time, they had left their initials, the people had actually shot bullet holes into it. 2,000 years old painting, and they're shooting holes in it. I mean, it's crazy. So this little town near the rock art, it's not even very close. It's about, by driving by car, about 40 or minutes, maybe almost an hour to get out to this place that's called Buckhorn Wash in the middle of Utah. And the town took on this project. They hired conservators who came out from New York. They collected money first, and then they had this project. They brought these two people out. Connie Silvers came out, and they cleaned up all of this graffiti. They removed it. The bullet holes are bullet holes. There's nothing you can really do. But they took off all the graffiti, and they put a little paved area and a porta potty. What do we call that in the Philippines? A little portable toilet,
Yeah, it's a portalet. We call it portalet, yes.
We do too. Portalet, right. So, and then they put a little fence, but only knee high, very low, and little interpretive panels. So when you walked across, when you were in front of the panel, this fence separated you from the panel by only about 10 feet, right? But you were very close. You could see these. These are large images, 4-foot high paintings. And then they asked questions. They didn't say, well, these were drawn by this group. They don't even know. These are ancient peoples that drew them. They don't even know what they mean. They can guess at what they mean. But the little panels ask questions. What do you think these images are trying to convey? What does it mean to you? And so they did this project, and the most defaced rock art panel in the country was much better, and it looked great, and people went to it, and it was lovely for 20 years. And then one night it was defaced again. Somebody went out there and wrote on it, and the townspeople wouldn't put up with it. They got the police to find out the person that did this. It turned out to be a father and his son, and they got drunk and they went out there and they defaced it. And so the community forced these people to pay the money to get another conservator to come out and clean the panel. And collectively, they changed they brought it back again. So it's wide open. It's just in the middle of nowhere, but there's a care that's going on in the community, a carefulness. I would say that's part of the solution, is that there has to be concern raised, that we collectively have to have understanding that these things are important, that we want people to value them. We want them to see them. We want them to actually touch them. Wash your hands, but come and look at our beautiful stuff so that you'll love it too, because you can only love it if you experienced it. So we want people to become advocates for its preservation. And I don't think there's an easy answer, but it's not just money. In your family or in someone's family who I'm speaking, there's someone out there whose family has kept something of great value to the family. It may not be worth a lot of money, but it's great grandpa's pipe or something. And it's been carried carefully through the generations for hundreds of years, a couple of hundred years maybe, by being careful, by being thoughtful, by not storing it where the dog will get it, by not letting little children break it and play with it, protecting it and then carefully giving it to the child when he's grown up or she's grown up. A lot of the keepers are women, giving it to them when they're old enough to understand what it means, and then they'll participate in taking care of it. So if you have no money, that's not an impediment to taking care of things. Being very careful and thoughtful, and asking older people what they would have done in the old days. But don't use a lot of furniture polishes or leather preservers, or all this stuff is garbage. Don't do that. It's not necessary, and it costs money, and you don't have money. If you're going to do one thing, and I'll stop and right, the one thing I would do is put it in a package. The Hope Chest is a classic package. It's a box. But for a book, maybe just a little box, and put it on a dry shelf. Don't keep anything on the floor. Try and make sure the room isn't going to flood or burn. And we cross our fingers. A lot of it is just luck and hope and care, being careful. And one more thing, when you put stuff away, the idea that you put it away, it's okay, but you should look at it now and then, because maybe something is changing. Maybe there's a leak at the back of that thing. Maybe there are insects that got in there and they're making a nest. We're storing textiles in a drawer, and we opened it up one day and there's all these bugs in there. Who knew? So we have to deal with the problem, but we don't want to ignore it. So now and then we have to use things, bring them out into the light, just check on them and be sure they're okay. That would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Randy. We can really learn a lot from our elders. And I understand that there's no easy answer to that question. We can always go back to what our elders have done before. Okay, Randy, there's also an answer from the head of archives of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. I think she also has some inputs to that question. So
I
I'll
love
call on Miss Amy Lagrama.
Hello,
Amy.
everyone. Hi, Rhea. Hi, Randy.
Hi.
I would like to add some answers to your responses already. Based on our experience, we also don't have a lot of money. But what I think that I can share with our webinar participants is more on preventive methods. Like if you know your library is susceptible to fire, like what you said earlier in the webinar, not use extension cords a lot. If you should have policies in place, like do not smoke within the building, or a lot smoking areas away from the building. Before buying more appliances like air conditioners or computer, make sure that your library can support the electrical load that those additional appliances. Also make sure that you are your electricity or electrical wirings are up to date. I mean, you can always contact your campus security or campus maintenance office to do that for you. In our case, someone does it for us. And also before we actually renovated our building, we had the Bureau of Fire Protection inspect, and they give us suggestions on how we can prevent fires in the building. So I think that's it didn't cost us a lot of money. We only bought lunch for the fire inspectors, and that was it. So I think I hope that would add more, that would help our participants. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Amy. There are practical ways on how we can prevent, deterioration of our things. So thank you so much, Amy and Randy. Okay, another question, Randy. This is also one of the most upvoted questions from an anonymous participant. Okay, for those who may have had these systems and technologies, I think it's referring to suppression, treatment, storage, etc., installed in their libraries or archives. Do we have, okay, I think, Randy, this is really intended for the Philippines, because this participant is asking about local suppliers here.
Oh.
And around how much do they actually cost in terms of money time, and staff training. But later, Randy, probably you have inputs, suppliers.
But maybe
Yeah.
Amy is better.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Maybe Amy should
All
field this.
right. Okay. I'm calling Amy again.
Oh, good, good.
Hi, Amy.
Hi again. Okay, local suppliers. I cannot give a specific name, but you can contact the Bureau of Fire Protection because they would know where to get you connected. Like for example, if you have sensitive materials like computer servers, you have rare bulk materials, and you will tell them that these materials cannot get wet or you have they're very sensitive. They can give you suggestions on what kind of fire suppressant system to use, and then they could maybe give you suggestions where or what company to get in touch with. Also, when we were renovating, or we are still renovating our Gonzales Hall or the UP Main Library, we gave these what do you call this specifications to our architects, and they were the ones who actually contacted this company so that when they will install it in the building.
Okay,
So
thank you.
specific names, I don't have any specific names.
Right. Okay. Also, Amy, there's a question here about local. Where is it? Okay. Local fire authorities. Okay, the local fire authorities are not really trained nor qualified to provide the kind of assessment required. What can we do to coordinate or jointly develop such assessments with them?
In our case, I had to go over what are the international standards, and then talk about it with our BFP. The Bureau of Fire Protections, they are concerned with this human safety. They are not concerned with the cultural heritage aspect of it. So it has to be a dialogue between you, the person who knows about these things, and them, which is the firemen who are concerned about the human safety. So we can talk to them about it so that you can address their concerns and they can address your concerns when they are doing your inspection within your building when you're visiting.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. There's also another question, Randy. There are local. They're asking for answers for some problems in the local setting. So since Amy's here, I'm gonna ask this also to colleagues in the Philippines. Would you know of any local ordinances or legal provisions or protocols for first responders in disaster response and recovery with regards to heritage materials or institutions, similar to what they have in Utah, as mentioned by Randy a while ago? So again, this person is asking about, would you know of any local ordinances or legal provisions or protocols for first responders in disaster response and recovery with regard to heritage materials institutions?
All right. Well, we have, like for example, you have cultural heritage groups locally. It depends on your company. Like for example, in Bohol, I know they have active cultural heritage groups that are really into these things. So it's your, I think when you are the one in that community, I guess it's up to you to get to know these people so that you can get in touch with them. For local ordinances, I am not sure, but in the national, why we have Republic Act 10066, National Heritage Act of the Philippines, although they're not very specific about what kind of response that we should have with regards to disaster management, but it specifically states there, let me pull out the actual statement, that in times of armed conflict, natural disasters, and other exceptional events that endanger the cultural heritage of the country, all national cultural treasures or national historical landmarks, sites, or monuments shall be given priority protection by the government. So I guess as citizens of this country, we should push this particular law with our local government officials so they can do something about responding to national heritage. Of course, there are international organizations like Blue Shield that can help us with that. We have NCCA, of course. I think Ma'am Emma Ray can also answer this question.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Amy.
comment
Yes,
now?
Randy. Yes, please.
So I want to support Amy's answer because I think it comes down to local if you're going to actually make progress. In the United States, we didn't have cultural property identified. So at the national level, there's something called FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So FEMA sort of sets the guidelines for the government as to how disasters will be addressed. And for many years, there was not cultural property included. Hurricane Katrina started people thinking because there was so much damage, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, so another governmental arm that gives grant money, suddenly is giving a lot of grant money. They'd done it before, but suddenly they're giving more grant money. And so the focus is starting to come onto FEMA saying, wait a minute, you've got to start thinking about this. And so some years ago, it's been now only about 10 or 12 years ago, so it's pretty recent still, FEMA finally created this ESF 11, the Emergency Support Function 11, that deals with cultural property. It's new. And then it's up to the states to implement it. And so what we did was say, look, the federal government has said that this is important. Now we're saying it's important for our state. So I don't know how the Philippines divides geographic areas up, but in the US, there's states. So my state government was willing. It took a lot of years, though. I have to say, this is not easy. It's 5 years of discussions. And FEMA, probably it was 10 or 20 years of discussions where they finally came around and supported this. But at the end of the day, Amy's right. It's we the people joining together to voice a need. And the cultural property is so important that I think we can win somebody's attention if we're persistent. So I think that was a good answer. I like that.
Okay, thank you so much, Randy. Okay, another question. This person is from an anonymous participant again. I think he comes from Marikina City. Just to give you a background, Marikina City is one of the cities in Metro Manila that is prone to floods. Okay, so according to this person, from Marikina City, as a mitigation method, the library was moved to the third floor. Thus, collection were not affected by the Typhoon Ulysses. Typhoon Ulysses is one of our super strong typhoons that hit the Philippines, specifically Metro Manila. Do you recommend pipe sprinklers as a cheap resource for mitigation against fire?
Well, there's a loaded question. Now you're going to blame me when the sprinklers go off.
I understand.
But I hedged my bet before. I think so if you've raised the collection up off of the out of the floodplain, that's brilliant. That's really thoughtful. If I had to choose, and I've been put in a position to say this before, if I have to choose between fire suppression, where I'm actually putting out the fire, or smoke detection, where I'm actually trying to sense that there's a problem before it happens, I think it's cheaper and it's better for the collection if we can make the smoke detection work. The trick is you've got to have a responder that is serious, that they can't have Christmas off. Nobody was there. So the office was empty and then the alarm came in. So sorry, but your building burned down. Then it's not really a smoke detection system. It's just a joke, right? If we can really, and I think it's worth investing in a really good smoke detection system, which still costs a fraction of what a wet pipe fire suppression system costs. Still, if your building burns down, you're going to blame me because you're going to say, well, why did you tell me that? But because of money, because of cost, it's if you did only the smoke detection first, that's maybe a first step, and it's cheap relative to the cost of a wet pipe fire suppression system. I would like to hear from my colleagues. What do you think of that idea, Amy? Am I foolish?
Okay. Okay, let's hear from. Oh, that's Amy talking.
I
Yeah.
would like to hear Amy's thought.
Um, it also depends on what kind of materials that you have in your library. So I cannot answer specifically for myself because I would have to know what kind of materials that I have. If they are rare materials, I'm not sure if I would use a wet sprinkler kind of system. If I could afford it, I'd get the ones like the one you mentioned earlier where the when you put a mist, saturate a mist, and then you don't feel the wetness, that would be great. But you have to consider a lot of factors, right? It's your budget, the kind of collection that you have, and also maintenance. If you can actually have it for a long time, but how do you know if it's going to work when you actually need it? Someone has to maintain it. So for me, that's one thing that you have to think about as well. So I cannot suggest. I cannot what do you call this? Suggest a specific answer. There's a lot of things that you have to think about as well. So
Can I put you on the spot? Can I ask, do you have a smoke detection system in your library?
we right now, yes, I just ordered one. We transferred to our new storage because our building is being renovated. So that's one of the first things that I have to put in our storage system. Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Randy and Amy again. Okay. Another question. Okay, I think we still have time for maybe two more questions. Okay, for books which are drenched in rainwater due to leaks, will freezing the book and throwing it in a microwave help restore it? If so, what is the ideal temperature to set the microwave in? I have learned this in a different seminar, but is it really effective?
Here's the problem. So a microwave, you know what happens if you put a fork in a microwave and turn it on?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a bad day, right?
Yes.
There are tiny little particles, I mean tiny, in paper, in poor quality paper, not in really beautiful Renaissance paper, but in crummy 19th century, 20th century papers. There can be tiny little flecks of metal, and they can exist as well in the bookbinder's board. And those, if you put anything in a microwave that's got metal, those things are going to catch fire. The drenched book, I know it seems really wet, but let's back up. The new technology is not the answer. It just because it's a microwave and you can cook your you can warm up your coffee, that it's good for that. I love that, but baking the books isn't going to help them, and it's going to heat the water, superheat the water, which will actually cook the book itself. I know it seems like it'll take forever, but if you thaw out the frozen book, if it's dripping wet, and put fans right on it and blow a lot of air at it, even in the Philippines, it will dry eventually. So it will take time. And when you create a lot of airflow, it doesn't eliminate mold as an issue, but it pushes it pretty far down. So your odds of getting a really wet book dry again by just circulating air are pretty good. And I know you don't want that hard step but if you dry a book by air drying and it takes 7 days, 8 days, 10 days, what you can do is after 7 days, if the book is relatively dry, you can start pressing it at night. Because now the pages are all going to be cockled looking. It looks very weird, but you can smooth them out and then put a brick on it and leave it overnight. But don't leave it more than that. Come the next day, open it back up and fan it and blow the air in it again, and go between those two stages of using fans and then using pressure, and you can minimize the distortion. But if it's a 19th or 20th century book, it will cockle. That is. And the other point is, before we ever start in on all that, is that book a replaceable book? Is there is it a National Geographic? I didn't actually tell you how difficult it is to dry a coated stock book. You have to separate every single page. if it's like a magazine like National Geographic, every single page use either Polytext or wax paper. And wax paper works, but it's not great. The wax paper will get wet. You'll have to throw it away and put in more dry wax paper. And now the book is completely full of this wax paper or Polytext. And then you have to blow air past it for a long time to get it to dry. If you could replace that book for $20, maybe it's cheaper in the long run just to find a new copy. But if it's a very important book, either to you personally because it's got grandpa's signature in it or because it's a historically valuable book, you have to go through the drying process. I think no microwaving.
Okay, remember that to our dear participants. Please do not put them in the microwave, okay?
Put
So
the
you have
copy
to
in the
dry them.
microwave, then go back to drying the book.
Yeah, go back to drying the book naturally. Okay, we still have a lot of questions, Randy, but I'll just ask one more question. Okay, and probably the other questions posted here will be emailed to you so you can answer them in your free time. And we will email your answers to all our participants.
Oh,
Okay. So, one last question before we close this question and answer portion. I have realized the importance of the whole community in the preservation of our museums and libraries. How can we do that in our environment? I think this participant is asking us how can he or she do that in his or her own context or community where only a few of them make it important. Not everyone knew in the community, not everyone in the community knew the importance of preservation of museums and libraries. So I think how can we champion that particular aspect or advocacy in the community?
I have one idea, but I would like to hear Emma's thought on this. So it would be a great honor to hear what Emma thinks. But let me say one idea. So somebody's talked about so the idea of inviting people in to get them to help and then give them, food, right? I think that's making a celebration out of the process. I think that's important. I used to believe that if I could get donuts and coffee for the firemen, and then the fire department would take a tour of the building, and then so first we're going to give them something to eat and drink, and then they'll wash their hands, and then I'm going to show them the most beautiful thing in my collection. I want to walk them into the vault and actually take some stuff and look at it and say, this is why it's important. Because when the firemen come to fight a fire in my building, I don't want them to make a mistake and think, well, if we put out the fire like we did when we, dealt with the restaurant fire next door, everything will be good. I want them to see these beautiful things are inside of this building. And if we spray water all over the place, they're likely to get ruined. And I talk about that and see if we can raise their awareness. I think that is also good with the general public, bringing people into see our special things, sharing it with people. I think it helps. What do you think, Emma?
Yes, we realize that we have so many education and training workshops to do at this stage, and we have been to many disaster areas, and our experience is that we really can rely on the locals. So if you are a cultural center, if you are a library or archives in an area, you must have outreach programs, invite potential volunteers. You can have volunteers for your libraries and archives and make disaster management as one of your workshops. Because yes, really, in Iloilo, in Tacloban, we got volunteers that help us with the recovery of materials.
Okay, thank you so much, Emma.
And with the local ordinance, I think at the national level, there is an effort to include the cultural agencies in the National Disaster Management Council of the government.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ma'am Emma. Okay, before I close this question and answer portion, Randy, would you want to have some last words to all our participants?
Oh,
Yeah, any last words to our participants, some reminders or anything that you would like them to remember most?
oh, not so much. You can see the film again if you want to. You can contact me. My email is at the end of that film. I want to say thank you for attending. I want to say thank you to the organizers because there's a process going on here that's really important, and it's formative. It's taken many years for these groups to come together to invite me. I think the process of bringing a lot of energy together makes a louder noise when you speak with one voice as a larger group. I think you can have more influence, and so I would encourage the kinds of things that you're doing. I think it's wonderful, and I think you should understand that it's wonderful and that there is no feedback when you do this. At the end of the day, everyone goes home. That's the end of it, and you could do another workshop next month and every month for the rest of your life, and it will never be enough. But it's a process, and it grows. And the way we have to build support is to be collectively aware that this is what we need. So keep doing this work. Congratulations to Emma and to Mac and to Urea and to all of you for your efforts to be participants in this, and to all of the other people that are out there. I know there's lots of you listening. Congratulations for having the interest in this. It's a fascinating area. It's wonderful. Historic material is innately wonderful, and when you get to see these things, I think it can inspire you. And if you can inspire someone else by sharing your historic things with them, it also helps to build the conversation. Make it, you don't have to do fancy things. You just have to be nice. I think being nice, my wife would say, just be nice to each other. And it's a lot harder than it sounds, but good luck with that. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate. It's been a real honor for me. I enjoyed the heck out of it. So it's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Randy. The honor is ours, actually. Okay, and to all our participants, that is all the time we have for our question and answer portion. But don't worry, for those questions which were not addressed, the organizing committee will be sending them via email to Dr. Silverman, and we will email them to you. Okay, so after Randy answered all the questions, we'll email them to you. Okay, so don't worry, because Randy, we still have like 10 more questions to be asked. Okay, but we will just email them to you. Okay, at this point, we will be presenting a certificate of appreciation to our resource speaker.
Oh.
Okay, and the certificate reads, Society of Filipino Archivists, Philippine Librarians Association Incorporated, NCRLC, and the UP School of Library and Information Studies present the Certificate of Appreciation to Professor Randy H. Silverman for being the resource speaker during the webinar entitled Library and Archives Disasters, Mitigation, Recovery, and Mold, given this 15th day of July 2021 via Zoom.us platform. Signed by the President of SFA, Arnulfo Junio, the President of PLI NCRLC, Emma Ray, and the Dean of the UP School of Library and Information Studies, Mary Grace P. Golfo, Barcelona.
I'm so proud. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Randy.
It means so much to me. You are so kind to do that. I live in an academic world. I work at an academic institution, and I come up for my academic 5-year post-tenure review this year. That will be right there in my folder of things that I've accomplished. So
Yes,
I'm going to brag. I'm going to use this night to brag. So thank
yes, you add that in your portfolio, Randy.
you. Yes, very proud. And
Thank you.
I tell you what, it's very touching, the human side of this. And you've all been very kind to me, but I want to again thank Emma for speaking to this issue. You really did bring me to the Philippines, and I'm so
Yay.
pleased. Thank you for doing that. And Rhea, thank you for your hosting it, for
Yeah.
the moderating. It's been wonderful. You're all very kind, and this means a tremendous amount to me. I'm actually tearing up.
Oh
Sorry.
no. Oh
Oh
no,
yes.
Randy, you're also very kind, Randy.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Like you said, we all have to be nice. And I
Yeah,
think, yes, and in this world, kindness is never wasted. That has been my motto ever since.
yeah.
Okay, all right. And to give our closing remarks, let us all welcome the president of the Society of Filipino Archivists, Mr. Arnulfo Mac O. Junio.
Dear folks, today's webinar, Library and Archives Disasters, Mitigation, Recovery, and Mold, has come to an end. On behalf of the Society of Filipino Archivists, along with the Philippine Librarians Association, National Capital Region Council, and the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies, I'd like to commend and express my heartfelt gratitude to our resource speaker, Mr. Randy Silverman, for sharing unselfishly his time and expertise with us and made us realize that preservation is truly the heart of all our undertakings. What he has shared would surely be of great help as we strive to ensure the prolonged life of valuable records in our custody during this pandemic. I would also like to thank the members of the organizing committee, to Fly President Emma M. Ray, SLIS Dean Mary Grace P. Golfo Barcelona, Ms. Denise Marie Cruz Betia, Ms. Efragian Margaret Santos Neres, Ms. Amy Rhea Eslagrama, Ms. Rhea Rowena Apolinario, Ms. Nelia Balagapo, Sirs Gianni Sormieda, Mark Anthony Santos, Jonathan Isip, Mark Ryan Betia, and Rafael Joseph Del Mundo for facilitating the conduct of this webinar. Of course, big thanks to all of you for making this event a success. Your positive response to our invite is the kind that inspires us, proponent of this webinar, to offer you trainings that are worth your time and resources. I fervently hope that you'll be able to make use of the knowledge gained from this training in your career as information and heritage preservation professionals. Once again, thank you and God bless.
Thank you so much, Sir Mac. And before we end today's webinar, let me just give a few reminders to our registered participants. The link to the evaluation form we emailed you earlier this week needed to be changed. Thus, we will send you the new link later today. We are also adjusting the deadline to accomplish the evaluation form to July 22, 2021 at 12 o'clock noon. Please follow the Society of Filipino Archivists, PLY NCRLC, and the UPSLIS Facebook pages and YouTube channels for upcoming events and webinars like the one we just held. Lastly, this webinar can be applied for self-directed learning CPD points. Thus, on behalf of the Society of Filipino Archivists, the Philippine Librarians Incorporated, NCR Librarians Council, and the UP School of Library and Information Studies, we would like to thank all of you who attended today's webinar. Again, this is Ria Rowena Apolinario, your host and moderator. Good morning, good evening, and stay safe.